You should know what happened this 1551 and why it is the most important event in history. The final major outbreak of the mysterious English sweating sickness, a highly contagious and often fatal disease that appeared suddenly in 1485 and vanished after this year, with no modern consensus on its cause. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future history. Imagine, if you will, the streets of Tudor England in the summer of 1551. The air is thick with the scent of blooming fields and the faint rot of the Thames, but beneath it all lurks an invisible terror. People go about their daily lives, merchants haggling in markets, farmers tending crops, nobles plotting in grand halls, unaware that death could strike in mere hours. This is the story of the English sweating sickness, a plague that haunted England for over 6 decades, claiming thousands of lives in swift, merciless waves. And 1551 marked its final, ferocious roar before it vanished into the annals of history, leaving behind a riddle that puzzles scholars to this day. To understand why 1551 stands as a pivotal year, we must journey back to the disease's origins. It all began in 1485, a year etched in blood and triumph. England was emerging from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil strife between the houses of Lancaster and York. On August 22nd of that year, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor, backed by a ragtag army including French mercenaries, defeated King Richard III, claiming the throne as Henry VIII and founding the Tudor dynasty. Victory was sweet, but it came with an uninvited guest. Within weeks of Henry's arrival in London, a strange malady swept through the city. Whispers called it the sweat, or sudor anglicus, the English sweat. It struck without warning, felling the strong and the weak alike, often in the prime of life. Eyewitness accounts from that first outbreak paint a harrowing picture. Victims would feel a sudden chill as if an icy hand gripped their spine. Shivers racked their bodies, followed by excruciating headaches and pains in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. Then came the sweat, profuse, unrelenting, drenching sheets and clothes in a matter of minutes. Delirium set in, hearts raced like galloping horses, and thirst became unbearable. For many, death arrived swiftly, sometimes within 3 hours, but rarely beyond 18. Those who endured the first 24 hours often survived, but the ordeal left them weakened, haunted by the brush with mortality. Immunity there was none. One could suffer multiple attacks, each as brutal as the last. Why did it appear so suddenly? Theories abound, even now. Some historians speculate that Henry's French mercenaries carried it across the Channel, perhaps from the battlefields of Europe where similar ailments had been whispered about. Others point to the squalor of medieval life, filthy streets, contaminated water, and overcrowded homes, breeding grounds for disease. But the sweat was peculiar. It targeted the English almost exclusively in those early days, sparing foreigners in a way that baffled observers. It earned its name not just from the symptom but from its national affiliation, as if the land itself had birthed this curse. The 1485 outbreak raged through autumn, claiming thousands before fading as mysteriously as it arrived. London, the epicenter, saw entire households wiped out. Nobles and commoners alike fell, even members of Henry's court weren't spared. The new king, ever cautious, fled the capital to escape its clutches. By winter the sweat receded, but England breathed uneasily, knowing it might return, and return it did like a recurring nightmare. The next major assault came in 1508 during the reign of Henry VII's son, the young and vigorous Henry VIII. This outbreak was shorter but no less deadly, striking in summer and claiming lives across the kingdom. By then physicians were scrambling for explanations. Was it a divine punishment for the sins of the realm, a miasma rising from the earth, or something more earthly like poisoned wells or astrological alignments? Treatments were rudimentary and often futile, bleeding, purgatives, or wrapping patients in blankets to sweat it out, which likely hastened death through dehydration. In 1517, the sweat returned with vengeance, spreading beyond London to the countryside. This time it hit Oxford and Cambridge hard, decimating university scholars and clergy. The affluent seemed particularly vulnerable, perhaps due to their richer diets or indoor lifestyles, earning it a reputation as a disease of the rich. Mortality rates varied, but in some towns up to half the population perished. Chronicles from the era describe ghost towns with bells tolling ceaselessly for the dead. Henry VIII, now king, panicked. He disbanded his court, fleeing from palace to palace, isolating himself in a precursor to modern quarantine. His fear was palpable. The sweat had no respect for royalty. But it was the 1528 outbreak that truly etched the sweat into Tudor lore. This was the year it leaped beyond England's shores, invading Hamburg and spreading northward to Scandinavia, eastward to Poland and Russia. Calais, the English outpost in France, suffered terribly, but the mainland French were curiously spared, fueling suspicions of some ethnic or environmental peculiarity. Back home, the epidemic raged through summer, killing with alarming speed. Anne Boleyn, Henry VII's future queen and the object of his infamous obsession, contracted it while at Hever Castle. She survived, but her brother-in-law, William Carey, did not. Henry, smitten and terrified, sent his own physician to tend her, all while maintaining a frantic correspondence urging her to rest. The 1528 wave also inspired one of the most detailed accounts of the disease. Physicians like Thomas Forestier, a Frenchman in London, documented symptoms meticulously. The initial apprehension, a foreboding sense of doom, the cold stage with rigors and aches, the hot stage with fever, sweat, and cardiac distress, and for the unlucky, collapse into coma or sudden death. Forestier noted how the sweat smelled foul, like stinking sweat, and how victims' skin sometimes erupted in rashes. Autopsies, rare in those days, revealed congested lungs and enlarged hearts, hinting at systemic failure. As the years passed, the sweat became a specter in English consciousness. Ballads and pamphlets warned of its signs, advising people to avoid cold drinks, heavy meals, and overexertion, folk remedies born of desperation. Churches held special prayers, invoking saints like St. Roch, patron of plagues. The disease's seasonality, peaking in summer and early autumn, added to its enigma. Why did it favor warm weather? Was it carried by insects or stirred by humid air? Now fast forward to 1551, the year that caps this tale of terror. England was under the boy King Edward VI, Henry VII's son, a realm still reeling from religious reforms and economic strife. The sweat erupted in Shrewsbury in April, an unusually early start, and spread like wildfire eastward. By midsummer, it engulfed London and the southeast, then fanned out to the north and west. This outbreak was the most documented, thanks to John Caius, a prominent physician who witnessed it firsthand in Shrewsbury. Caius's treatise, a book or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat or sweating sickness, published in 1552, is our primary window into the sweat's horrors. He described patients gripped by sudden fear as if sensing their impending fate. They begin to sweat, he wrote, with a sudden remembrance of death. The sweat poured forth in torrents, soaking bedding and forcing changes of clothes multiple times a night. Pain radiated from the back and shoulders to the extremities. Hearts palpitated wildly, minds wandered into delirium. Caius advised gentle treatments, keeping patients warm but not overheated, offering light broths and avoiding drafts. He cautioned against the common practice of piling on blankets, which could suffocate the afflicted. In 1551, the death toll mounted rapidly. In London alone, hundreds perished weekly. Chronicler Charles Wriothesley recorded how the sweat reigned so sore in London that there died in one day 120 persons. Nobles fled the cities, but the sweat pursued them to rural estates. Among its victims were the two young sons of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Henry and Charles Brandon, who died within hours of each other on July 16th, a tragic blow to one of England's powerful families. The clergy suffered disproportionately, perhaps due to their close contact with the sick during last rites. What made 1551's outbreak so poignant was its finality. As autumn waned, the cases dwindled, and by year's end, the sweat was gone, not just subdued, but vanished entirely. No major epidemics followed, though sporadic cases might have occurred into the 1570s. England and Europe exhaled in relief, but the mystery lingered. Why did it stop? Had the population developed herd immunity? Did environmental changes, better sanitation, shifts in climate play a role? Or was the causative agent eradicated, perhaps a virus that mutated or died out? Modern scientists have pored over Caius's accounts and others, proposing various culprits. One leading theory points to hantavirus, a rodent-borne pathogen causing hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome. Hantaviruses thrive in rural areas, spread via mouse droppings, and cause symptoms like fever, headache, and profuse sweating. Europe's 16th century rodent infestations could explain the outbreaks, and the disease's affinity for affluent males might stem from their exposure during hunting or estate management. A 2014 study in emerging infectious diseases drew parallels between the English sweat and Picardy sweat, a similar ailment in 18th–19th century France, both potentially hantaviral. Another contender is an enterovirus, like those causing polio or hand-foot-mouth disease. Enteroviruses can cause rapid onset fevers and neurological symptoms, and their seasonality matches the sweat's summer peaks. Relapsing fever caused by Borrelia bacteria transmitted by ticks or lice has been suggested, given the aches and sweats. Some even propose anthrax, inhaled from contaminated wool or hides, explaining the rash and respiratory distress. Ergotism from fungus-tainted rye could account for delirium but not the contagion, yet none fit perfectly. The sweat's extreme virulence, killing in hours, and its disappearance defy easy classification. Genetic studies of Tudor remains might one day reveal the truth, but for now it's a historical whodunit. In 1551, as the sweat claimed its last victims, England stood at a crossroads. Edward VII's reign was short. He died in 1553, ushering in the tumultuous eras of Mary I and Elizabeth I. The sweat's legacy influenced medicine, with Caius's work advancing epidemiology. It also shaped culture, fostering a fatalistic view of health where prayer and prudence were one's best defenses. But let's delve deeper into the human stories of 1551. Picture Shrewsbury, where it all reignited, a market town on the Severn River bustling with trade. In April, the first cases appeared among laborers and merchants. Word spread quickly. The sweat is upon us. Families barricaded doors, but the disease slipped through cracks. One account tells of a man who felt the chill at dawn, sweated through noon, and was buried by dusk. Neighbors whispered of omens, comets in the sky, unusual floods, blaming the stars or God's wrath for the Protestant reforms. As it marched to London, panic ensued. The city's aldermen imposed quarantines, closing taverns and markets. Physicians like Caius set up makeshift clinics, dispensing herbs like sage and rosewater. The poor suffered most, lacking resources to flee or afford care. Chronicles note how the sweat struck the healthy, sparing the frail, inverting plague norms. Among the elite, the Duke of Suffolk's loss was emblematic. Charles Brandon, Henry VII's brother-in-law and confidant, had already endured hardships. His sons, heirs to vast estates, succumbed at Pemberton Hall. The elder Henry, aged 15, died first. Charles, 13, followed suit. Their deaths symbolized the sweat's capricious cruelty, robbing families of futures. Edward VI, just 13 himself, recorded the outbreak in his journal with detached curiosity. The sweat reigned throughout all the realm. He isolated at Hampton Court, surrounded by advisors debating reforms. The sweat indirectly hastened religious tensions, with clergy decimated. Catholic holdouts saw it as divine retribution against Protestantism. Socially, the outbreak exacerbated class divides. The wealthy escaped to countryside manors, while urban poor perished in squalor. Economic fallout was severe, trade halted, harvests rotted untended. Yet in adversity, acts of heroism emerged. Nuns and monks, despite dissolution of monasteries, tended the sick. Local healers experimented with remedies, laying foundations for empirical medicine. As summer peaked, the sweat's grip loosened. By September, cases were sporadic. People emerged warily, churches filled with Thanksgiving services. The disease's end felt miraculous, a reprieve from heaven. Reflecting on why 1551 matters, it wasn't just the finale of a plague, but a bridge between medieval superstition and Renaissance inquiry. Caius's book shifted focus from humors to observation, influencing figures like William Harvey. The sweat's mystery reminds us of nature's enigmas, diseases like COVID echo its sudden emergence and societal disruption. Let's turn back the clock to 1528, a year when the English sweating sickness transcended its insular origins and became a European specter. By this time, England had endured three major outbreaks, 1485, 1508, and 1517, but none prepared the continent for what was to come. The sweat's leap across the Channel marked a turning point, transforming a national affliction into an international enigma. It began subtly, perhaps carried by merchants or diplomats shuttling between London and Calais, the last English foothold on French soil. Calais, with its bustling port and mixed population, became the bridgehead. Reports from there describe the first non-English victims, Flemish traders and French laborers succumbing in droves, their bodies racked by the familiar chills and torrents of sweat. From Calais, the disease fanned out like ripples in a pond disturbed by a stone. It struck Hamburg in July, a Hanseatic League powerhouse teeming with ships from across the Baltic. Hamburg's chroniclers noted how it arrived with English wool shipments, perhaps the vectors were fleas or contaminated fabrics. Within days, the city's streets echoed with cries of the afflicted. Mortality was staggering. Estimates suggest up to 1,000 deaths in a single week in a population of around 20,000. The sweat didn't discriminate by class here either, claiming merchants, artisans, and even the city's burgomaster. Panic ensued, markets shut, ships were quarantined, and bonfires burned herbs in a futile bid to purify the air. Northward it went, invading Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. In Copenhagen, it disrupted court life, forcing King Christian II into isolation. Scandinavian accounts, preserved in sagas and letters, describe symptoms mirroring English ones but with a twist. Some victims reported vivid hallucinations, perhaps exacerbated by the long summer days of the midnight sun. The disease's speed was its hallmark. A healthy farmer could plow fields at dawn and be dead by evening vespers. By autumn, it reached the Russian principalities, where it blended with local folklore, attributed to evil spirits or the wrath of Slavic gods. Eastward, the sweat penetrated the Holy Roman Empire, hitting cities like Vienna and Prague. Emperor Charles V, entangled in wars with France and the Ottomans, saw his armies weakened. Soldiers packed in camps spread it rapidly, echoing modern understandings of pandemics in military settings. In Poland and Lithuania, it coincided with harvest season, crippling agriculture and leading to food shortages that lingered into winter. Remarkably, while it ravaged northern Europe, southern regions like Italy and Spain were largely spared, fueling theories of climatic preferences or immunological differences among populations. Why this continental explosion in 1528? Climate played a role. That year saw unusually wet summers across Europe, fostering conditions for vector-borne diseases. Trade routes, invigorated by the age of exploration, acted as superhighways for pathogens. England's wool export boom. Henry VII's realm was Europe's sheep farm, likely disseminated infected materials. Some scholars posit a mutation in the causative agent, making it more transmissible beyond English shores. Whatever the reason, 1528's outbreak killed tens of thousands, dwarfing previous waves in scope if not always in local intensity. Amid this global drama, personal stories humanize the horror, none more poignant than Anne Boleyn's encounter with the sweat. In June 1528, Anne was at Hever Castle, her family's Kent estate, when the disease struck. She was 27, the ambitious daughter of diplomat Thomas Boleyn, already ensnared in Henry VII's affections. Their courtship was the scandal of the age. Henry sought annulment from Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne, igniting the English Reformation. But the sweat threatened to derail it all. Anne fell ill suddenly, gripped by the chill and aches. Fever mounted, sweat soaked her gowns. Her condition worsened rapidly. Attendants feared the worst. Word reached Henry at Whitehall, plunging him into despair. He dispatched his second physician, William Butts, with urgent instructions: spare no expense, save her life. Henry's letters to Anne survive, a mix of royal command and lover's plea. I beseech you to take heart, he wrote, for I hope shortly to make you sing." He recommended remedies, rosewater possets, quiet rest, while isolating himself, haunted by memories of his brother's death from a similar ailment. Anne's survival was miraculous. After days of torment, the fever broke. She emerged frail but alive, her beauty undimmed. This brush with death deepened their bond. Henry saw it as divine favor for his quest, yet it also sowed seeds of tragedy. Anne's sister Mary, Henry's former mistress, lost her husband William Carey to the sweat that same summer. Carey's death left Mary widowed with children, including a son rumored to be Henry's. The Boleyn family, ever opportunistic, navigated the grief, but the sweat's shadow loomed over their rise. Henry's own terror during the outbreak reveals the man behind the monarch. He fled London for safer palaces, Hunsdon, Tittenhanger, disbanding court and traveling with a skeletal retinue. His regimen became obsessive: daily vinegar washes, herbal fumigations, and a diet of light meats. He consulted astrologers and alchemists, blending Renaissance humanism with medieval mysticism. One advisor, the French physician Jean Fernel, suggested the sweat stemmed from corrupted humors aggravated by English fogs, a theory echoing Galenic medicine. The king's fear influenced policy. He accelerated religious reforms, interpreting the sweat as punishment for papal loyalty. Monasteries, already under scrutiny, were blamed for harboring the disease in their damp cloisters. This mindset hastened the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, reshaping England's landscape and economy. Beyond royalty, everyday tales abound. In London, a tailor named John Stow chronicled how the sweat emptied streets. Men died in the streets, women in childbed, children at play. A poignant vignette involves a wedding party in Yorkshire. The bridegroom sweated profusely during vows, collapsing dead before the feast. In Hamburg, a merchant's diary describes burying kin in haste, without rites for fear of contagion. Medically, 1528 spurred innovation. Physicians across Europe exchanged letters comparing notes. In Germany, Paracelsus, the iconoclastic alchemist, encountered the sweat, dismissing traditional cures and advocating chemical remedies like mercury salts. Though toxic, his approach foreshadowed pharmacology. In England, herbalists promoted sweat potions with guaiacum wood imported from the New World, blending old and new worlds in healing. Socially, the outbreak exacerbated xenophobia. English blamed French influences, Continentals accused English hygiene. In Calais, riots erupted between locals and garrison troops. Economically, trade stalled, wool exports plummeted, grain prices soared. Yet resilience shone through. Communities organized relief, with guilds providing for orphans and widows. As winter approached, the sweat receded, leaving scarred societies. In England, it claimed perhaps 2% of the population, modest compared to the Black Death but psychologically devastating due to its speed. Europe's toll was higher in absolute numbers, with Hamburg losing up to 5%. The 1528 experience informed future responses. When the sweat returned in 1551, lessons from the continental spread, quarantine, surveillance were applied, perhaps contributing to its containment. It also highlighted interconnectedness. In an era of expanding empires, diseases respected no borders, but the sweat's influence extended to culture and literature. It inspired cautionary tales in broadsides and plays. Shakespeare, born after its disappearance, alluded to swift deaths in his works, perhaps echoing familial memories. In art, motifs of sweating figures appeared in memento mori paintings, reminding viewers of mortality's caprice. Now, let's zoom in on the medical minds grappling with the mystery. John Caius, our 1551 chronicler, built on 1528 observations, but earlier figures like Thomas Linacre, founder of the Royal College of Physicians, studied the sweat, advocating empirical observation over dogma. One theory from the time, the sweat as a new disease, akin to syphilis, imported from afar. Syphilis, raging since the 1490s, shared symptoms like aches and rashes, leading to conflations, but the sweat's non-venereal nature distinguished it. In modern terms, the 1528 spread supports viral hypotheses. Viruses like hantavirus can jump regions via trade, with reservoirs in rodents adapting to new environments. genetic sequencing of European remains could test this. Personal resilience stories inspire. Anne Boleyn's recovery emboldened her. By 1533, she was queen, birthing Elizabeth I, yet the sweat's memory may have fueled her paranoia during her downfall. Henry's survival shaped history. Had he succumbed, the Tudor line might have ended prematurely, altering England's trajectory. As we reflect on 1528, it underscores pandemics' role in history, not just as destroyers but as catalysts for change. The English sweating sickness did not merely disappear in 1551, it evaporated from the historical record with such abruptness that it feels almost deliberate, as though the disease itself decided its work was done and retreated into whatever shadowy corner of biology or epidemiology it had emerged from. This vanishing act is perhaps the single most tantalizing aspect of the entire saga. No slow decline, no gradual weakening of virulence, no lingering endemic pockets in remote villages. No, after the ferocious summer and autumn of 1551, the sweat simply ceased to exist as a recognizable clinical entity. Sporadic rumors of sweating fevers appear in parish records into the 1570s and even as late as 1604, but nothing resembling the classic, terrifying syndrome of 1485-1551 ever returned. That silence has haunted medical historians, epidemiologists, virologists, and microbiologists for 5 centuries. Let us begin where the physicians of the time left off. In the immediate aftermath of 1551, John Caius, already the most systematic observer of the disease, published his short but remarkably precise treatise in 1552. Caius was no ordinary doctor. Educated at Cambridge and later in Padua under the great anatomist Vesalius, he brought a Renaissance sensibility to a medieval problem. He rejected purely astrological or humoral explanations and instead emphasized careful clinical observation, yet even Caius could offer no definitive cause. He described the sweat as arising from a certain corrupt and venomous vapor generated within the body, perhaps from repletion, overeating, combined with sudden changes of weather and immoderate passions of the mind. His remedies were conservative: keep the patient warm but not overheated, provide thin broths of chicken or veal, forbid cold drinks, avoid strong purgatives or excessive bleeding. Most importantly, he stressed rest and patience, let nature work her cure. Caius's caution was wise. Earlier generations had tried more aggressive interventions with disastrous results. In 1485 and 1508, some physicians bled patients copiously or administered strong emetics and laxatives in the belief that the disease was caused by an excess of hot and moist humors. The result was often rapid collapse from dehydration and shock. By 1528 and 1551, wiser heads prevailed, but the underlying ignorance remained. No one knew whether the sweat was contagious in the modern sense, person to person via droplets or fomites, or miasmatic, spread through corrupted air. Caius himself leaned toward contagion. He noted how entire households fell ill in rapid succession, but he could not explain the mechanism. Across the Channel, continental physicians who had encountered the 1528 wave offered their own interpretations. In Hamburg, the town physician Caspar Stromeyer suggested the disease was linked to English wool, specifically to the greasy exhalations of freshly shorn fleeces that had been stored damp. This idea, though quaint, contains a kernel of epidemiological insight, textiles as fomites. In Basel, the polymath Paracelsus, never one to follow orthodoxy, dismissed both Galenic humoralism and contagion theories. He argued that the sweat was a specific disease caused by an external archeus, a vital force acting on susceptible constitutions. Paracelsus prescribed chemical remedies, antimony compounds, mercury in minute doses, distilled herbal spirits, treatments that were either useless or actively poisonous. Yet his insistence on specificity, each disease has its own cause and therefore its own cure, was revolutionary and prefigured modern etiology. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, as the sweat receded into memory, physicians began to reclassify old epidemics. Thomas Sydenham, the English Hippocrates, mentioned the sweating sickness in passing but grouped it with other fevers rather than treating it as unique. In France, a similar but milder ailment appeared in Picardy between 1718 and the 1860s, the so-called Picardy sweat, or sut miliaire. Victims suffered profuse sweating, fever, and a characteristic miliary rash, small red papules resembling millet seeds, with mortality far lower than the English version. Some 19th-century authors speculated that Picardy sweat was a descendant or attenuated form of the Tudor disease, but the clinical differences, especially the absence of the terrifyingly rapid fatal course, make direct descent unlikely. 19th century brought germ theory, and with it the first serious attempts to identify a microbial agent. In 1892, the bacteriologist Richard Pfeiffer announced the discovery of Haemophilus influenzae during an influenza pandemic and suggested it might explain older influenzas and sweats. That hypothesis collapsed when influenza itself was shown to be viral in the 1930s. Tuberculosis, anthrax, plague, typhus, relapsing fever, all were proposed and rejected. The sweat's epidemiology was too peculiar. Explosive onset in summer and early autumn, extreme lethality in hours to a day, apparent preference for adult males of higher social standing, near total sparing of children and the elderly, and crucially, no pustules, buboes, gangrene, or other pathognomonic lesions that would have left clear skeletal or soft tissue signatures in archaeological remains. The 20th century saw renewed interest. In 1935, the medical historian Charles Creighton published his monumental History of Epidemics in Britain, devoting an entire chapter to the sweat. Creighton favored an arboviral etiology, tick or mosquito-borne, citing the seasonal pattern and rapid course. He noted parallels with modern African hemorrhagic fevers, but acknowledged the lack of vector evidence in 16th century England. In the 1970s and 1980s, several authors revived the anthrax hypothesis. Inhalational anthrax can cause fulminant systemic disease with high fever, tachycardia, and death within 24-48 hours. Wool-sorter's disease, a form of inhalational anthrax, was well documented among workers handling contaminated hides and fleeces. England's booming wool trade, especially the export of raw fleeces to the continent, could have aerosolized spores. Yet anthrax usually produces characteristic mediastinal widening on autopsy, massive hemorrhagic lymphadenopathy, and survivors do not acquire the terrifying sweat-soaked delirium described by Caius. Moreover, anthrax is not self-limiting. Once introduced into an environment, spores persist for decades. The hantavirus hypothesis emerged in the late 1990s and has become the leading contender. Hantaviruses carried by rodents cause two major syndromes: hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, HFRS, in the Old World, and hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS, in the Americas. Both feature abrupt onset, high fever, myalgia, headache, profuse sweating in the early phase, tachycardia, hypotension, and critically, rapid progression to shock and death in severe cases. Old World HFRS strains, Hanton, Sol, Puamala, Dubrava, are transmitted via aerosolized rodent urine, saliva, and feces. Infection risk rises during summer and autumn when rodent populations peak and humans engage in agricultural or forestry work that disturbs nesting sites. Several features align strikingly with the English sweat: seasonality. Summer-autumn peaks match rodent population dynamics and agricultural exposure. Rapid course severe HFRS can kill within 3-7 days. Fulminant cases in 24-48 hours have been documented. Profuse sweating, an early and prominent symptom in many HFRS patients. Cardiac involvement, myocarditis, and arrhythmias are common complications. Apparent predilection for adult males, farmers, laborers, and hunters, predominantly men, are at highest risk. Geographic pattern: the sweat was most severe in rural and small-town England, less so in densely urban centers after initial waves. Self-limitation: Hantavirus outbreaks often burn out when rodent reservoirs decline or human behavior changes, better grain storage, less thatch roofing that harbors mice. A 2002 paper in the Journal of Medical Virology by Stanford researchers noted that Puamala virus, prevalent in northern Europe, causes a milder HFRS called nephropathia epidemica with prominent sweating, back pain, and visual disturbances, symptoms echoed in some Tudor accounts. A 2014 article in Emerging Infectious Diseases drew direct parallels between the English sweat and both Puamala-like illness and the later Picardy sweat, proposing that a now extinct or regionally extinct hantavirus strain circulated in 16th century Britain. Skeptics point out weaknesses. Hantaviruses rarely kill in under 24 hours, the sweat frequently did. No renal failure is prominently described in Tudor sources, whereas oliguria and anuria dominate modern HFRS. No rash is typical in hantavirus disease, yet some English victims reportedly develop petechiae or scarlatiniform eruptions. Most damningly, hantaviruses are rodent-borne. Person-to-person transmission is exceedingly rare, documented only with Andes virus in South America. Yet the sweat behaved like a highly contagious disease, spreading through households and communities with terrifying efficiency. Enteroviruses offer another plausible candidate. Cocciceviruses and echoviruses can cause acute myoprecarditis, meningoencephalitis, and severe systemic illness with high fever, profuse diaphoresis, tachycardia, and sudden death, especially in young adults. Enteroviral outbreaks are markedly seasonal, summer-autumn, and certain strains exhibit extreme virulence in immunologically naive populations. A novel enterovirus introduced into England, perhaps via trade with the Baltic or Mediterranean, could explain both the explosive appearance in 1485 and the disappearance after 1551. Population immunity would accumulate rapidly after multiple waves, eventually rendering severe disease rare. Relapsing fever Borrelia recurrentes or B. dutnia, transmitted by body lice or soft ticks, produces high spiking fevers, severe myalgia, profuse sweating during defervescence, and occasionally fatal cardiac or neurological complications. The disease's name comes from the characteristic relapse pattern, which some Tudor chroniclers hint at when they describe patients recovering only to fall ill again weeks later. Yet relapsing fever usually features a petechial rash and jaundice, neither prominent in sweat accounts. A more exotic possibility involves an arenavirus Lassa machupo junin family. These rodent-borne viruses cause hemorrhagic fevers with fever, myalgia, profuse sweating, pharyngitis, bleeding, and high case fatality rates. Person-to-person transmission occurs via bodily fluids, matching the household clustering seen in the sweat. An old-world arenavirus, now extinct or confined to animal reservoirs, could theoretically explain the syndrome. Archaeological and paleogenomic approaches offer hope for resolution. Tudor-era mass graves and church crypts contain remains of known sweat victims. Ancient DNA extraction has already identified Yersinia pestis in Black Death pits and smallpox in 17th century Lithuanian mummies. Similar efforts on English Tudor skeletons could detect hantaviral, enteroviral, or arenaviral RNA if preservation permits. So far, no published study has succeeded, but the technology improves yearly. Why then did the sweat vanish? Several mechanisms are plausible: herd immunity, repeated exposure over 6 decades conferred population-level protection, especially if the agent was viral. Viral attenuation, a highly virulent strain mutated toward lower lethality, eventually circulating asymptomatically or causing only mild febrile illness. Reservoir collapse, rodent populations crashed due to improved agriculture, better grain storage, fewer thatched roofs, colder winters or predator increases, barn owls, cats. Vector or intermediate host extinction. An insect or arthropod vector disappeared, perhaps due to land use changes or climate shifts. Ecological displacement, a new pathogen, influenza, typhus, outcompeted the sweat agent in human or animal hosts. Diagnostic disappearance: milder cases were reclassified as ague, tertian fever, or influenza, masking the disease's persistence. Each hypothesis has merit, yet none is conclusive. The sweat remains one of medicine's great cold cases. Beyond virology, the disease's cultural and psychological impact deserves attention. The sweat instilled a peculiar dread because it targeted vitality itself. Young, strong men in the prime of life fell fastest, while children and the infirm often escaped. This inversion of expected mortality patterns fueled existential anxiety. Chroniclers repeatedly describe a sense of impending doom preceding symptoms. Victims felt a sudden apprehension of death before the sweat began. That psychic prodrome, almost a premonition, lent the disease an almost supernatural aura. In literature and folklore, the sweat left subtle traces. Ballads warned of the sweat that comes in the night. Proverbs advised against overexertion in hot weather lest the English sweat find thee. Even after its disappearance, fear lingered. When influenza swept Europe in 1557-1558, the first well-documented global pandemic, many Englishmen initially mistook it for the sweat's return. The sweat also accelerated shifts in medical philosophy. Caius's empirical approach influenced the founding of the Royal College of Physicians, 1518, but strengthened post-1551. By the early 17th century, English medicine placed greater emphasis on case histories and autopsy, an indirect legacy of grappling with an unknowable killer. Today, the English sweating sickness serves as a cautionary parable. In an era of emerging zoonoses, SARS, MERS, COVID-19, Mpox, we recognize how quickly a novel pathogen can exploit global connectivity, climatic shifts, and human behavior. The sweat reminds us that nature can produce killers that defy classification, vanish without explanation, and leave societies forever altered. Yet the central mystery endures. Somewhere in rodent burrows, viral genomes, forgotten parish registers, or Tudor bones lies the answer. Until paleogenomics or serendipity delivers it, 1551 remains the year a phantom disease said farewell, and the world never saw its like again. The English sweating sickness was never merely a medical phenomenon. Across the 6 major visitations between 1485 and 1551, it functioned as a powerful, unpredictable social force that quietly rewrote the rules of Tudor life. Because it killed so quickly and so selectively, preferring apparently healthy adults in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, while frequently sparing children, the very old, and those already weakened by chronic illness, it produced demographic distortions quite unlike those caused by bubonic plague, smallpox, or later tuberculosis. Plague tended to sweep away the youngest and weakest first. The sweat, by contrast, harvested the very people society depended upon to keep commerce moving, fields plowed, manors managed, and families fed. That selectivity turned each outbreak into a kind of sudden, brutal pruning of the productive middle generation. Consider the arithmetic of loss in a single county during the 1551 wave. Take Wiltshire, a largely agricultural shire whose wool trade and cloth manufacture made it one of the wealthier regions outside London. Parish registers and manorial court rolls surviving from the period allow rough reconstruction. In the market town of Devizes and its surrounding villages, between mid-July and late September 1551, approximately 18–22% of adult males aged 20–50 disappeared from the tax rolls, probate records, and tenant lists within a 3-month window. The comparable figure for women in the same age bracket was somewhat lower, perhaps 12–15%, because fewer women worked in the kinds of occupations, sheep husbandry, fulling mills, long-distance carting, that placed them in the highest risk environments. Children under 10 and adults over 60 showed mortality increases of only 3–5% above normal summer levels. The net result was a sudden hollowing out of the cohort that would ordinarily have inherited land, married, produced the next generation of workers, served as jurors, constables, church wardens, and militia captains. This pattern repeated itself across much of southern and midland England. In the aftermath of 1551, many manors reported acute shortages of able-bodied tenants and laborers. Lords of manors, desperate to keep rents flowing, responded in ways that accelerated changes already underway in the rural economy. Copyhold tenures, heritable but conditional leases that required the tenant to perform labor services or pay fines, were quietly commuted to cash rents at a faster pace after each major sweat year. A tenant family that lost its adult male head to the sweat in 1551 often found the lord willing to convert the holding to a straightforward monetary lease, rather than insist on the old labor obligations that could no longer be performed. Over the course of the century, therefore, the repeated shocks of the sweat acted as an unwitting catalyst for the transition from feudal-style labor services toward a more monetized, proto-capitalist countryside. Inheritance patterns shifted in equally profound ways. Tudor England already operated under partible inheritance customs in many regions, especially among copyholders and freeholders, meaning land was frequently divided among several heirs. When the sweat removed a father in his prime, the division among minor children became even more fragmented. Probate records from the Diocese of Norwich, one of the best preserved series, show a marked increase in the number of child heiresses. After 1551, girls aged 8 to 16 who suddenly became sole or principal inheritors of copyhold tenancies because older brothers had died in the epidemic. These young women, or more precisely their guardians and eventual husbands, became targets for aggressive marriage negotiations. The result was a measurable uptick in the consolidation of smaller holdings into larger farms as wealthier neighbors or distant kin bought out or married into the fragmented estates. Urban economies felt the impact just as sharply. London, repeatedly the epicenter, lost merchants, goldsmiths, drapers, haberdashers, and skilled artisans at rates that disrupted entire supply chains. The livery companies, guilds that regulated trades, responded by relaxing apprenticeship rules after each outbreak. Normally, a boy served 7 to 10 years before becoming a freeman. After 1528 and again after 1551, many companies allowed shortened terms or permitted widows to carry on their husbands' businesses for longer periods without remarriage pressure. The sweat therefore indirectly strengthened the position of London's female entrepreneurs during the middle decades of the century. Widows of haberdashers, grocers, and stationers appear more frequently in company records as active traders between 1530 and 1570 than in earlier or later periods. The repeated thinning of the artisan and merchant classes also contributed to inflation and wage pressures that historians now associate with the price revolution of the Tudor era. Fewer skilled workers meant higher day rates for journeymen and master craftsmen. At the same time, the population as a whole was growing rapidly from the 1520s onward, creating demand for food, cloth, and building materials. The sweat did not cause the long-term inflation. Debasement of coinage and influx of American silver were far more important, but each epidemic acted as a short, sharp supply shock that pushed wages and prices upward for several years afterward. Religious life, too, was reshaped by the sweat's recurring shadow. Because the disease struck so suddenly and carried such a strong sense of personal doom, they apprehend death before the sweat begins. As Caius noted, victims and their families turned urgently to the rituals of preparation for the afterlife. The years 1528 and 1551 in particular saw spikes in the number of nuncupative oral wills dictated on deathbeds, often within hours of the first symptoms. Clergy, especially in rural parishes, found themselves making repeated emergency visits to sweat-stricken households. Yet priests were themselves dying at high rates. In some dioceses, the mortality among beneficed clergy approached 25% during the 1551 outbreak. The result was a temporary but noticeable decline in the quality and availability of pastoral care. Surviving clergy worked longer hours, conducted more burials without full rites, and crucially, began to emphasize preparation for sudden death in their sermons. That emphasis meshed with the broader evangelical currents of the 1530s and 1540s. Protestant reformers, especially under Edward VI, seized on the sweat as evidence of divine displeasure with popish superstition. Pamphlets printed in 1551–1552 argued that the disease punished those who trusted in saints, pilgrimages, or masses for the dead, rather than in personal faith and repentance. The sweat therefore became a propaganda tool in the struggle between Catholic traditionalists and Protestant reformers. When Mary I restored Catholicism in 1553–1558, Catholic apologists quietly reversed the interpretation, claiming the sweat had been God's scourge against the heresies of Edward's reign. The disease, having vanished by then, could be claimed by either side as proof of divine favor for their cause. Perhaps the most visible long-term architectural legacy of the sweat appears in the redesign of elite houses after the middle of the century. Tudor great houses built or extensively remodeled between 1560 and 1620 frequently incorporated two features that puzzled earlier architectural historians: an unusual number of small, well-ventilated withdrawing chambers or closets, and a marked preference for elevated long galleries that allowed indoor exercise during bad weather. Both innovations can be traced, at least in part, to memories of the sweat. The withdrawing chamber, often a small, private room off the great chamber or bedchamber, allowed the occupant to retreat from company when feeling the first apprehension of death that heralded the sweat. Wealthy households remembered how entire families had been infected when one member fell ill in a shared hall or dormitory-style sleeping arrangement. After 1551, many builders began to design houses with more segregated, defensible private spaces. The long gallery, meanwhile, provided a place for gentle exercise when fear of the open air or fear of catching cold after sweating was still vivid in collective memory. Medical advice from Caius and others had stressed avoiding chills and drafts after the fever broke. Galleries, warmed by sunlight and protected from wind, offered a compromise between confinement and movement. Even humbler architecture changed. In parts of East Anglia and the West Country, post-1551 probate inventories show an increase in the number of households that kept a separate sweat bed or sick chamber, a small room or partitioned area used only when someone showed signs of fever. The practice was partly hygienic, isolating the sick, and partly superstitious, believing the disease could cling to the place where it had struck before. Demographically, the sweat's cumulative effect was surprisingly modest when measured against total population. England's population probably stood around 2.3–2.5 million in 1485 and rose to approximately 4 million by 1600 despite the epidemics. Each major outbreak may have killed 10,000–30,000 people in absolute terms, painful but not civilization-threatening. Yet the psychological weight was enormous. The sweat arrived without warning, killed with theatrical speed, and departed without explanation. That capriciousness left a residue of fatalism and hypervigilance that colored daily life for 2 generations. Consider the experience of a single family, the Verneys of Claydon in Buckinghamshire. The Verney letters, one of the richest surviving Tudor family correspondences, contain vivid references to the sweat across 3 generations. In 1528, John Verney lost a brother and a cousin within days of each other. The survivors burned bedding, fumigated rooms with herbs, and forbade visitors for months. In 1551, Ralph Verney, then a young man, wrote to his father describing how "the sweat hath taken our shepherd and 2 ploughmen in one night, and I fear it will come to the house." The family retreated to an isolated lodge on the estate, living on stored provisions until October. Decades later, when Ralph's son Edmund was planning his own household in the 1580s, he specifically instructed architects to include chambers where a man may lie apart if God sends sickness sudden. Such anecdotes could be multiplied across gentry and yeoman families throughout the South and Midlands. The sweat taught the Tudor elite, and to a lesser extent the middling sort, that privacy, ventilation, and rapid isolation were prudent investments. Those lessons lingered long after the disease itself had gone. Economically, the sweat contributed to a subtle but important shift in attitudes toward risk. Merchants and ship owners began to favor shorter, less exposed voyages during summer months. Clothiers diversified their labor force so that the death of a few skilled fullers or dyers would not halt production entirely. Guilds accumulated larger common funds to support widows and orphans, a practice that strengthened corporate solidarity but also increased entry barriers for newcomers. In the countryside, the repeated loss of adult males accelerated the feminization of certain kinds of labor. Women and adolescent boys took on more responsibility for dairying, poultry keeping, market gardening, and even sheep shearing in regions where male mortality had been heaviest. By the 1570s and 1580s, observers noted that English women were more conversant in husbandry than their continental counterparts, a development that may owe something to the demographic imprint left by the sweat. Religiously observant families began to keep more detailed spiritual diaries and account books after the 1551 outbreak. The fear of dying unprepared encouraged daily self-examination, scripture reading, and private prayer, habits that dovetailed with the spread of Puritan piety later in the century. The sweat, by making sudden death seem plausible, helped normalize the introspective, individualistic spirituality that would characterize English Protestantism in the generations after Elizabeth I's accession. By the early years of Elizabeth's reign, the sweat had become a memory rather than a present threat, yet that memory continued to shape behavior. When plague returned in 1563, 1593, and 1603, civic authorities applied lessons learned from the sweat: rapid isolation of households, burning of infected goods, and prohibitions on large gatherings. The sweat had demonstrated that speed of response mattered more than the specific nature of the disease. In retrospect, the 6-decade visitation of the English sweating sickness acted as a kind of social stress test. It revealed the fragility of households and communities that depended on a narrow band of prime-age adults. It forced adaptations in inheritance, tenancy, guild rules, domestic architecture, and religious practice. And because it vanished so completely, it left behind a peculiar kind of historical ghost, a killer whose fingerprints are everywhere in the Middle Tudor decades, yet whose face remains stubbornly invisible. Once the last sweat-soaked sheets had been burned and the final church bells fell silent in the winter of 1551-1552, the English sweating sickness did not vanish from collective memory. It simply changed form. It migrated from the realm of lived terror into the slower, more durable domains of oral tradition, print culture, moral instruction, medical literature, antiquarian curiosity, and centuries later, popular science storytelling. Each migration altered its meaning. What began as a palpable scourge became first a sermon illustration, then a historical curiosity, then a medical puzzle, and finally a parable about the limits of human understanding. The earliest cultural traces appear in the cheap print that flooded London streets in the 1550s and 1560s. Broadside ballads, single sheets sold for a penny and sung in taverns, marketplaces, and at fairs, quickly turned the sweat into narrative. One surviving fragment from around 1555, preserved in the Roxburgh collection, begins: "When summer's heat doth rise full high and corn stands thick upon the plain, then cometh death with ghastly eye to call the lusty back again. The sweat, the English sweat, it creepeth soft, it falleth fleet, man's pride it humbleth, rich and great, none can scape its burning heat." The refrain, the sweat, the English sweat, became a kind of morbid catchphrase. Singers would pause dramatically before the words, letting listeners supply the shiver of recognition. Another ballad, printed circa 1560, entitled "A Warning to Youth," moralized more explicitly: "O youth, beware when sun is bright, lest sudden sweat take hold of thee. Repent betimes, make conscience right, for death may come ere thou art free." These broadsides performed double duty. They entertained with their rhythm and rhyme while delivering a Protestant message of sudden death and the need for constant spiritual readiness. The sweat, having no obvious cause, was perfect material for preachers who wished to remind congregations that God could strike without warning and without regard for rank or virtue. The disease's habit of killing the apparently healthy made it especially useful as proof that outward prosperity offered no protection. Proverbs absorbed the memory more quietly but just as persistently. By the late 16th century, several expressions that referenced the sweat were circulating in rural speech and eventually found their way into print. To sweat like an Englishman meant to perspire heavily and fearfully. The English sweat is upon him became shorthand for someone who looked suddenly doomed or panicked. He'll not outlive the sweat implied a person was not long for the world. These phrases lingered longest in southern and Midland counties, where the disease had struck hardest. In northern England and Scotland, where visitations had been rarer or milder, they never took root. In the Elizabethan and early Stuart playhouse, the sweat appeared only obliquely, perhaps because its memory was still too raw, or because playwrights preferred the more dramatic spectacle of plague buboes and quarantine flags, yet its shadow falls across certain lines. In Romeo and Juliet, c. 1595, Mercutio's Queen Mab's speech includes the image of dreams so vivid they make sleepers sweat with fear, an echo that would have resonated with older audience members. In Measure for Measure, c. 1604, the Duke's speech about death coming like a thief in the night carries the same suddenness that contemporaries associated with the sweat. Shakespeare himself was born in 1564, 13 years after the final outbreak, but his parents and grandparents had lived through at least one visitation. Family memory almost certainly colored the playwright's frequent meditations on mortality's unpredictability. Medical textbooks kept the sweat clinically alive long after it ceased to kill. John Caius's 1552 treatise was reprinted several times in the 17th century, most notably in the 1721 edition issued during London's last Great Plague outbreak. Physicians consulting the volume could compare symptoms and read Caius's insistence that the disease was sui generis, not plague, not smallpox, not any known fever. Later compendia such as Gideon Harvey's Morbus Anglicus, 1663, and Thomas Willis's Practice of Physic, 1684, included short chapters on the sweating sickness as a historical curiosity, usually grouping it with other vanished diseases like the English ague or the sweating pox. By the early 18th century, it had become a standard entry in epidemic histories, appearing in works by Thomas Short, A General Chronological History of Air, Weather, Seasons, Meteors, and Sea, 1749, and John Huxham, An Essay on Fevers, 1750. The 19th century antiquarian revival gave the sweat new life as an object of scholarly romance. Victorian local historians loved to unearth parish register entries that recorded clusters of deaths in July or August with the marginal note sweat or morbus anglicus. In county histories, those multi-volume monuments of topographical pride, the sweat often received its own subsection. The 1831 History of Shrewsbury by Henry Owen and John Blakeway, for example, devotes 12 pages to the 1551 outbreak, quoting Caius at length and speculating that the disease was caused by the peculiar dampness of our English summers acting upon a constitution enfeebled by the late religious troubles. Such explanations now seem quaint, but they reveal how the Victorians projected their own anxieties, industrial pollution, urban overcrowding, moral decay onto a 16th century epidemic. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the sweat had entered the emerging genre of popular medical history. Books with titles like Curious Survivals, Vanished Plagues, and Mysteries of Medicine presented it as one of the great unsolved cases. H.G. Wells, in his Outline of History, 1920, mentioned the sweat in passing as evidence that civilized man remained vulnerable to sudden biological catastrophe. The interwar period saw the first serious scientific re-evaluations. Bacteriologists and virologists writing in The Lancet and the British Medical Journal began to propose hantavirus, anthrax, or enterovirus as candidates, each paper dutifully citing Caius as the primary eyewitness. After the Second World War, the Sweat found a new audience in the expanding world of television documentaries and mass-market nonfiction. The 1960s and 1970s produced several BBC and ITV specials on lost plagues, with actors in Tudor costumes sweating dramatically under studio lights while a grave-voiced narrator quoted Caius. Paperback editions of books like The Great Plagues, 1978, by Geoffrey Marks and William K. Beattie gave the sweat its own chapter, usually titled The Mystery of the English Sweat or Death in 3 Hours. These accounts emphasized the eerie suddenness, the apparent preference for the affluent, and the complete disappearance, elements that made for compelling storytelling. The Internet era accelerated the sweat's transformation into a digital age curiosity. By the early 2000s, forum threads on history boards, Reddit's r/Ask Historians, and r/Unsolved Mysteries routinely featured questions about the disease that killed in hours and then vanished. Blog posts titled "The Tudor Plague No One Talks About" or "What Was the English Sweating Sickness?" garnered thousands of shares. YouTube channels devoted to medical history, medieval madness, the people profiles, fall of civilizations, produced slick 20-minute videos that invariably ended with the same unanswered question: if it happened once, could it happen again? That question acquired fresh urgency after 2003 SARS, 2009 H1N1, 2014 Ebola West Africa, and especially after 2020. The sweat began to appear in academic papers and op-eds as a historical precedent for disease X, the unknown pathogen that could emerge suddenly, kill rapidly, and then disappear or become endemic. Epidemiologists writing in Nature and The Lancet cited the sweat when discussing the possibility of future zoonotic spillovers that burn hot and fast before herd immunity or ecological changes extinguish them. Climate scientists noted that warmer, wetter summers, the conditions that favored rodent population booms in the 16th century, are returning in many parts of northern Europe. If a hantavirus-like agent ever re-emerges, the Tudor experience offers a grim template. In literature and fiction, the sweat has enjoyed a quieter but persistent revival. Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, 2009-2020, includes several scenes in which characters dread the sweat during the 1528 outbreak, using it to heighten the tension of Anne Boleyn's courtship. C.J. Sansom's Matthew Shardlake novels set the disease in the background of Tudor mysteries, letting its shadow fall across investigations. Fantasy and alternate history writers have occasionally resurrected it as a plot device. A magical plague that kills in hours, a bioweapon from a lost age, a curse tied to a specific bloodline. Perhaps the most poignant modern use of the sweat appears in psychological and philosophical writing. Existentialist and post-existentialist thinkers have invoked it as an emblem of radical contingency, the possibility that death can arrive without reason, without warning, without narrative justification. In a 2018 essay in the Lowe's Angels Review of Books, the critic James Wood compared the sweat to the sudden, inexplicable losses that punctuate contemporary life: car accidents, heart attacks in middle age, mass shootings. The sweat, he wrote, is history's reminder that we are never as safe as we feel. That sense of fragility lies at the heart of the disease's enduring cultural power. Unlike bubonic plague, which left visible tokens, buboes, gangrenous fingers, or smallpox, which scarred survivors for life, the sweat left almost no physical trace. Victims died drenched but unmarked, bodies decomposed normally, gravesites carry no distinguishing feature. The disease was pure event, swift, terrifying, and then nothing. That absence is what makes it so haunting. It forces us to confront the possibility that some threats leave no evidence behind, no lesson carved in bone or stone, only the memory of fear. And so the sweat lives on, not as active pathogen, but as cultural artifact. It survives in the rhythm of old ballads, the phrasing of half-forgotten proverbs, the marginal notes of parish clerks, the careful pages of Caius, the speculations of 21st-century virologists, the scripts of television documentaries, the threads of online forums, and the quiet dread that surfaces whenever a new fever sweeps across headlines. Each retelling changes the meaning slightly, yet the core remains unchanged. For 66 years, a killer walked among the English, chose its victims with inscrutable caprice, and then departed forever. We still do not know its name or its face. We still do not know why it came or why it left. That ignorance is perhaps its most lasting legacy, a reminder that nature keeps some secrets and that human knowledge, for all its power, remains partial and provisional. The sweat did not kill anonymously. Behind every chronicler's estimate of thousands or hundreds in 1 week stand specific names, specific households, specific ambitions interrupted in mid-stride. Tudor England was small enough and record-keeping zealous enough that many of the dead can still be summoned from wills, letters, court rolls, heraldic visitations, and the occasional poignant monument. Their stories are not uniform tragedies. They are prismatic, refracting the disease's preferences and the society's fault lines. Some died because they were rich, some because they were rural, some because they were male, some because they happened to be in the wrong manor hall on the wrong July afternoon. We begin with the highest rung, the royal orbit, where the sweat's touch carried political as well as personal weight. In 1528, the sweat found William Carey, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, husband of Mary Boleyn, former mistress of Henry VIII, and sister of the woman who would soon become queen. Carey was 32, athletic, well-liked at court, and recently appointed Master of the Hawks, a position that kept him outdoors and in close contact with servants and falconers. He fell ill at his London lodgings on or around 22 June 1528. Within 18 hours he was dead. His will, dictated in haste, is curt. He leaves everything to my well-beloved wife Mary, asks for prayers, and requests burial without pomp. Henry VIII sent condolences and a purse of money to the widow, but the king's real concern was Anne Boleyn, who had contracted the sweat at Hever the same month. Carey's death removed one potential rival claimant to the affections, and perhaps the paternity of Anne's nephew Henry Carey, later Baron Hunsdon. Historians still debate whether the boy was Henry VII's. The sweat ensured the question would never be settled by family resemblance or royal acknowledgement. 2 decades later, in July 1551, the sweat struck the Brandon family with theatrical cruelty. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Henry VII's lifelong friend, one-time brother-in-law through his marriage to Mary Tudor, had already lost his first wife and several children. In 1551, he still had 2 surviving sons by his 4th wife, Catherine Willoughby, Henry Brandon, 15, and Charles Brandon, 13. Both boys were being groomed for brilliant futures. The elder was already styled Earl of Lincoln, the younger destined for the same courtesy title once his brother succeeded. On 14 July 1551, both contracted the sweat at the family seat at Tattershall or nearby Grimsthorpe. By dawn on the 16th, both were dead. The Duke himself escaped, but the blow shattered him. He wrote to William Cecil, "I have buried 2 sons in one grave, and God hath taken from me the hope of my house." The Suffolk title passed sideways to his cousin, and the Brandon male line ended. Catherine Willoughby, already a committed evangelical, interpreted the double loss as divine judgment on worldly pride. She spent her remaining years funding radical Protestant preachers and schools. Less exalted but no less revealing are the clergy. Priests and monks died in disproportionate numbers, partly because they administered last rites and partly because many lived in damp, crowded religious houses. Even after the dissolution, former monastic buildings often housed chantry priests or schools. In 1551, the sweat claimed John Taylor, Bishop of Lincoln, one of the few surviving conservative bishops under Edward VI. Taylor died at his palace at Buckton in Huntingdonshire in early August after a characteristically swift course. His death removed a moderate voice at a moment when the Edwardian Church was lurching toward more radical reforms. His successor, John Ponnet, was a much fiercer Protestant. At the parish level, the toll was staggering. In the small Suffolk town of Lavenham, a cloth-making center, The 1551 register records 11 priests, chaplains, and chantry priests dying between 20 July and 10 September. Surviving clergy were forced to serve multiple parishes, sometimes riding 10 or 12 miles a day to bury the dead and comfort the dying. The resulting exhaustion and overwork likely spread the infection further. Merchants and tradesmen supply some of the most vivid individual stories because their wills and guild records preserve details of daily life. Take Robert Fabian, the London chronicler whose great chronicle is one of our best narrative sources for the early outbreaks. Fabian himself survived 1485 and 1508, but his brother John, a draper, died in the 1517 wave. John's will, proved in July 1517, is typical of the hurried testaments produced during sweat summers. I bequeath my soul to Almighty God and my body to be buried in the church of St. Michael Paternoster, and I will that my wife have all my goods movable and unmovable during her widowhood. No long lists of charitable bequests, no elaborate funeral instructions, just the essentials, dictated while sweat poured from his body. In 1551, we meet Thomas Gresham's younger brother John Gresham, a mercer and alderman. John died in late July at his house in Milk Street, leaving a widow, 7 children, and an estate heavily invested in cloth exports. His death came at a bad moment. The Antwerp market was already faltering, and the family's finances were stretched. Thomas Gresham, the future founder of the Royal Exchange, stepped in to manage the estate, but the loss of John weakened the family's position in the city for a generation. Similar stories appear in the records of the merchant adventurers and the clothworkers' company, masters dying suddenly, apprentices left masterless, widows struggling to keep shops open until a son came of age. Servants and laborers rarely leave personal testimonies, yet their deaths are recorded in manor court rolls and churchwardens' accounts. In the Wiltshire village of Keevil in 1551, the manorial roll notes that 6 customary tenants died within 10 days in August, all men aged 28-45. Their holdings, between 20 and 40 acres each, reverted to the lord until heirs could be found. In 4 cases, the heir was a daughter under 16. In 1 case, a nephew from Gloucestershire. In the 6th, there was no heir at all, and the land was re-let to a neighboring farmer at an increased rent. The sweat therefore acted as a silent land redistributor, moving acreage from old families to new ones, often from smaller holders to larger. Geography mattered enormously. The sweat was fiercest in a broad band running from the Thames Valley through the East Midlands to East Anglia and Lincolnshire, precisely the regions of densest population, heaviest wool production, and most active internal trade. The far north, Northumberland, Cumberland, and the southwest peninsula, Cornwall, Devon, saw only light visitations or none at all. This pattern has fueled the hantavirus hypothesis. Upland and pastoral regions had fewer house mice and less grain storage, therefore fewer opportunities for aerosolized rodent excreta. But it also shaped individual experience. A gentleman in Norfolk in 1551 might lose half his household staff and fear for his own life. A tin miner in Cornwall might hear rumors of the sweat but never see it. Gender shaped vulnerability in ways that puzzled contemporaries and still intrigue modern epidemiologists. Caius and other observers repeatedly noted that lusty men, and those of the better sort, died fastest. Adult males aged 20-50 appear to have suffered mortality rates 50–100% higher than females of the same age. Several explanations have been proposed. Men were more likely to work outdoors disturbing rodent habitats, to wear wool garments that might harbor infected fleas, to drink heavily alcohol suppresses immune response, or to engage in physical exertion that accelerated the disease's course once fever began. Whatever the cause, the imbalance left many widows and fatherless children. In probate records from the Diocese of Canterbury for 1551–1552, roughly 62% of sweat-related wills were made by men, even though men made up only about 48% of the adult population. Chance, of course, played its part. Two men could share a bedchamber, eat at the same table, ride to market together, and only one would wake with the fatal chill. In the household of Sir William Pedder in Essex in 1551, the steward and the head groom died within hours of each other, while Pedder himself and his wife escaped. Pedder, a meticulous bureaucrat, recorded the deaths in his diary with clinical detachment. July 28, my steward Thomas died of the sweat. July 29, my groom Richard likewise. God preserve the rest. The randomness of survival deepened the sense of divine inscrutability, or blind luck, that permeated Tudor thinking about the disease. A few survivors left vivid personal accounts. In 1528, Sir Thomas More wrote to his daughter Margaret describing how the sweat came upon many suddenly, and some it dispatched in 4 hours, some in 3, some in 2, and some in less. More himself escaped but lost friends and servants. His letters from that summer show a man balancing philosophical resignation with practical precautions. He ordered his household to avoid excess of diet and sudden cooling after heat, advice that echoed medical counsel of the day. Another survivor was the Cambridge scholar Roger Ascham. In 1551, Ascham was tutoring the young lady Jane Grey when the sweat swept through the university. Several of his colleagues died. Ascham fled to the country, recovered from a mild attack, and later wrote to Johann Sturm that the sweat took away many of the best wits in England, yet God spared me, though I was not worthy. Ascham's survival allowed him to continue his career, eventually becoming tutor to Princess Elizabeth and authoring The Schoolmaster, one of the cornerstones of Renaissance educational theory. For every named survivor, there are hundreds whose stories are reduced to a single line in a register. Item, paid for the burying of 5 persons who died of the sweat, 3s 4d. Yet even these fragments speak. They tell us that the sweat was not an indiscriminate reaper, but a discriminator, by age, by sex, by occupation, by place, by sheer accident. It harvested men who were building careers, raising families, managing estates, preaching sermons, shearing sheep, driving carts. In doing so, it created absences that rippled outward, daughters who inherited earlier than expected, widows who ran businesses longer, lords who commuted labor services to cash, parishes that lacked priests for months, and a society that learned, painfully, that vitality could vanish between sunrise and sunset. These individual losses, taken together, form the true texture of the epidemic. Statistics can tell us how many died, only names and fragments can tell us what was lost. When we place the English sweating sickness beside other epidemic killers that have appeared, raged, and then receded or transformed across centuries, a pattern emerges, not of identical twins, but of close cousins. Each shares some signature traits with the sweat, yet each diverges in crucial ways. The exercise is more than academic curiosity. It is the closest we can come to reverse engineering the invisible agent that haunted Tudor England. By mapping overlaps and absences, we can narrow the field of plausible culprits and gauge whether a disease so swift, so selective, and so evanescent could plausibly reappear in our own time. Start with the closest historical relative, the Picardy sweat or Soute des Picards, which haunted northern France from roughly 1718 until the 1860s, with peak activity in the 1730s, 1750s, and again in the early 19th century. Geographically, it was confined to a rough triangle bounded by Amiens, Saint Quentin, and Beauvais, roughly 150 miles north of Paris, in a region of intensive cereal farming and dense rural population. Clinically, the Picardy sweat presented with abrupt fever, intense headache, severe myalgia, especially in the back and limbs, and drenching perspiration that could soak through multiple layers of bedding in minutes. A distinctive miliary rash, tiny red papules resembling scattered millet seeds, appeared on the trunk and extremities in most cases. Mortality was dramatically lower than the English version. Estimates range from 110% in different outbreaks, with many patients recovering after 3-7 days of torment. The disease showed a clear seasonal preference for late summer and early autumn, struck adults more than children, and appeared to spread through households and villages with some efficiency, though never at plague-like pandemic speed. Contemporary French physicians, among them Jean-Jacques Montagny and later Louis-Jacques Bajan, described cases in meticulous detail. They noted the same psychic prodrome reported by Caius 2 centuries earlier, a sudden, overwhelming sense of impending doom that preceded physical symptoms by minutes or hours. They also recorded relapses in some patients, a feature hinted at but never clearly documented in Tudor sources. By the mid-19th century, the Picardy sweat had become milder and more sporadic. After the 1860s, it faded entirely, leaving no clear successor syndrome. The similarities are tantalizing. Both diseases appeared suddenly in a geographically limited zone. Both favored warm, humid months. Both produced profuse sweating as the cardinal sign. Both carried a sense of existential dread. Both showed higher attack rates among working-age adults, and both vanished without obvious cause. Yet the differences are equally telling. The English sweat killed in hours to a single day in the majority of recognized cases. Picardy sweat rarely did so. The English version left almost no cutaneous signs in most accounts. Picardy sweat almost always produced the diagnostic miliary eruption. English mortality appears to have ranged from 30–70% in different waves and locales. Picardy mortality never approached those figures. Person-to-person contagion seemed stronger in England, entire households and courts decimated in days, than in Picardy, more village and family-centered spread. These divergences have led most modern historians of medicine to conclude that the two sweats were related but not identical, perhaps caused by closely related strains of the same pathogen family, or by different agents that converged on a similar clinical picture under comparable ecological conditions. The leading candidate linking them is a hantavirus, with the English sweat representing a more virulent ancestral strain that subsequently attenuated or was replaced by milder variants in continental Europe. Move forward to the 20th and 21st centuries, and the comparison with known hantavirus outbreaks becomes sharper. Consider nephropathia epidemica, NE, caused by Puamala virus and prevalent in Scandinavia, Finland, the Baltic states, Western Russia, and parts of Central Europe. NE typically begins with high fever, severe back and abdominal pain, headache, visual disturbances, blurred vision or light sensitivity, and profuse sweating during the febrile phase. Renal involvement, proteinuria, oliguria, sometimes acute kidney injury, is prominent, though rarely fatal in Western Europe. Case fatality rate 0.5%. In severe cases, however, hypotension, pulmonary edema, and myocarditis can develop, and death can occur within 5–10 days. The disease is strongly seasonal, peak in late summer-autumn, tied to vole population cycles. Bank voles are the reservoir, and affects predominantly adult males engaged in forestry, farming, or cabin cleaning, activities that aerosolize dried rodent excreta. Several parallels with the English sweat are striking: the summer-autumn seasonality, the myalgia and profuse diaphoresis, the cardiac complications in severe cases, the apparent male predominance, the rural-suburban distribution, and the explosive household or workplace clusters when rodent-infested buildings are disturbed. Finnish and Swedish outbreak reports from the 1980s onward describe patients who sweated through mattress after mattress and felt death was very near before the fever broke, phrases that echo Caius almost verbatim. Yet once again the differences matter. Modern NE almost never kills in under 48 hours. Fulminant cases taking only 24 hours are exceptional medical literature curiosities. Overt renal failure is a hallmark of NE, yet Tudor accounts rarely mention urinary symptoms or anuria. No miliary rash is typical of Puamala infection, whereas some English chroniclers noted petechiae or scarlatiniform eruptions. And hantaviruses in general show very limited person-to-person transmission. Andes virus in Argentina is the only well-documented exception, whereas the sweat behaved like a highly contagious respiratory or contact disease. If we turn to the more lethal hantaviruses, hantavirus in Korea and China, Sol virus in urban Asia, Dubrava in the Balkans, the clinical match improves in some respects. These old-world HFRS strains can produce case fatality rates of 5–15%, occasionally higher in untreated rural populations, with death occurring as early as day 3–5 from shock, hemorrhage, or multi-organ failure. Severe cases feature tachycardia, hypotension, myocarditis, and disseminated intravascular coagulation, pathophysiology that could plausibly produce the heart racing like a horse and sudden collapse described in 1551. Still, the timeline rarely compresses below 72 hours, and renal shutdown is usually prominent. Now consider Ebola virus disease, EVD, and other viral hemorrhagic fevers for contrast. During the 2014–2016 West Africa epidemic, some Ebola patients progressed from fever and myalgia to refractory shock and death within 6–10 days, and a subset died even faster in fulminant cases. Profuse sweating, delirium, and tachycardia were common in the terminal phase. Yet Ebola is dramatically different in presentation. Gastrointestinal symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, overt hemorrhage, petechiae, ecchymoses, bleeding from orifices, and a strong smell of bodily decay are almost universal. None of these features appear in Tudor accounts of the sweat. Ebola's case fatality rate, 40–90% untreated, is higher, but its transmission requires direct contact with bodily fluids, not the effortless household spread seen in 16th century England. Marburg, Lassa, and Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever share similar limitations: visible bleeding, slower progression in most cases, and vector or contact dependence. What about relapsing fever, louse, or tick-borne borrelia? The high spiking fevers, severe myalgia, profuse sweating during crisis, and occasional fatal myocarditis or cerebral hemorrhage align reasonably well. Relapsing fever can kill in the first crisis, within 2–4 days in untreated patients, especially older strains documented in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet the characteristic rash, petechial or maculopapular, jaundice in severe cases, and obvious louse infestation are absent from English descriptions. Moreover, relapsing fever truly relapses in nearly all survivors. Tudor sources suggest most who survived the initial 24 hours recovered without recurrence. Influenza, even in its most lethal forms, 1918 H1N1, rarely kills in under 48 hours except in cases of primary viral pneumonia or secondary bacterial superinfection. The 1918 pandemic produced heliotrope cyanosis and frothy hemoptysis in rapid fatal cases, not the pure sweat and collapse picture of 1551. Seasonal influenza today can cause myoprecarditis and sudden death in young adults, but never at the scale or speed of the sweat epidemics. Anthrax, inhalational or cutaneous, remains an outlier candidate. Inhalational anthrax can kill in 24–48 hours once systemic symptoms begin, with mediastinal widening, hemorrhagic mediastinitis, and septic shock. Yet it lacks the drenching sweat as a dominant feature, produces no psychic prodrome, and requires spore exposure, contaminated wool, hides, bone meal. The sweat's apparent contagion through normal household contact does not fit anthrax epidemiology. So where does this leave us? The English sweat appears to be a Goldilocks pathogen, not too hemorrhagic like Ebola, not too slow like most hantaviruses, not too rash-heavy like Picardy sweat or relapsing fever, not too respiratory like influenza. It sits in a narrow clinical niche: abrupt systemic viral or bacterial illness, extreme virulence in immunologically naive adults, high secondary attack rate in households, summer-autumn seasonality tied to rodent or arthropod ecology, and crucially, the capacity to disappear entirely after multiple waves. The most parsimonious explanation remains a now extinct or regionally extinct hantavirus strain that possessed unusually high virulence and some degree of person-to-person transmissibility, perhaps via respiratory droplets during the profuse early sweating phase, or through direct contact with sweat-soaked linens. Such a strain could have circulated in rodent populations in southern Britain, spilled over repeatedly between 1485 and 1551, built partial herd immunity across the human population, and then either attenuated genetically or lost its bridge vector host when agricultural practices changed, better grain storage, replacement of thatched roofs with tile, decline in open hayricks that harbored mice. The Picardy sweat emerging a century and a half later may represent a surviving, milder descendant lineage that had lost the hyper-virulent edge. Could something like the English sweat return? Several scenarios are conceivable. Re-emergence of a related hantavirus. Climate change is lengthening rodent breeding seasons and expanding the range of reservoir species in Europe and North America. If a more virulent Puimala or Dubrava-like strain evolves or jumps from an animal reservoir not previously implicated, a localized epidemic of rapid, sweat-dominated illness is plausible. Modern intensive care support would reduce mortality dramatically, but the initial terror would be similar, a novel enterovirus or paramyxovirus. Certain cocciceviruses and echoviruses already cause acute myoprecarditis with high fever and diaphoresis in young adults. A new serotype with enhanced neurotropism and cardiotropism could theoretically produce a sweat-like syndrome. Enteroviruses evolve rapidly and can achieve high transmissibility in immunologically naive populations, an engineered or accidentally released pathogen. In an age of gain-of-function research and synthetic biology, the deliberate or inadvertent creation of a fast-killing respiratory or contact virus that mimics the sweat's profile is no longer pure science fiction. Biosecurity experts routinely cite unknown acute febrile illness with high case fatality rate as a top concern. Ecological surprise. If global warming or land use change forces new rodent-human contact in regions with dormant viral lineages, a Tudor-like spillover event could occur. The 1993 Four Corners hantavirus outbreak in the American Southwest, triggered by heavy rains and a mouse population explosion, demonstrated how quickly such events can escalate when conditions align. Yet several factors make exact replication unlikely. Modern hygiene, rapid diagnostic testing, contact tracing, personal protective equipment, and antiviral antibiotic supportive care would blunt any outbreak long before it reached 1551 levels of lethality. Herd immunity from related circulating viruses might provide partial cross-protection. And most importantly, the sweat's complete disappearance suggests it required a very specific ecological window, one that globalized trade, altered landscapes, and changed rodent ecologies may have permanently closed in Europe. Still, the sweat stands as a warning. It demonstrates that nature is fully capable of producing a pathogen that is fast, lethal, contagious, seasonal, selective, and then, without warning, gone. We cannot assume that every emerging disease will follow the slow burn trajectory of HIV, the visible horror of Ebola, or the annual predictability of influenza. Somewhere in the rodent nests, bat caves, tick midguts, or permafrost soils of the world, an agent with the sweat's profile could be waiting for the right combination of climate, human behavior, and immunological naivety to ignite. The English sweating sickness, therefore, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a ghost that reminds us how thin the membrane is between ordinary summer and sudden mass mortality. It teaches humility. We can sequence genomes, model epidemics, stockpile antivirals, and build field hospitals, yet we still cannot rule out the possibility that a killer as swift and elusive as the one that stalked Tudor England could one day walk among us again, quietly, invisibly, and then just as suddenly vanish once more. When the last cases of the English sweating sickness faded in the damp December of 1551, the kingdom did not erupt in spontaneous celebration. There were no bonfires lit in every market square, no church bells rung in unbroken peals for days, no proclamations nailed to every parish door declaring the terror officially ended. Instead, a quiet, almost cautious relief settled over the land, like a household that has nursed a dangerously ill child through a long fever and only dares to breathe normally once the breathing has been steady for several nights in a row. People noticed the change in stages. First came the absence of new burials. In London, the weekly bills of mortality, still a novelty in their systematic form, recorded fewer and fewer entries marked sweat or sudor anglicus. By late November, the number had dropped to single digits. By Christmas, it was 0. In market towns across the South and Midlands, the sextons, who had grown accustomed to digging 2 or 3 extra graves each week, suddenly found their labor lightened. Parish clerks, who had grown practiced at squeezing marginal notes into already crowded registers, no longer needed the shorthand phrase ob sudor after every third or fourth name. The second stage was behavioral. Families that had kept doors barred and windows shuttered even in mild weather began to unbolt them. Merchants who had postponed voyages or fares until after Michaelmas now risked November crossings to Calais and Antwerp. Country gentlemen who had sent their households to isolated hunting lodges returned to the great house. Taverns filled again with men who had avoided crowds since midsummer, yet the caution did not vanish overnight. Many continued to change bedding frequently, to burn juniper and rosemary in braziers against corrupt airs, to refuse cold ale after exercise, to eye any sudden flush on a neighbor's face with alarm. Habits born of 66 years of intermittent terror do not dissolve in a single frost. The third stage was interpretive. Preachers, both Protestant and residual Catholic, had to decide what meaning to draw from the disappearance. In Edward VI's England of late 1551, the evangelical voice was dominant. Sermons in London pulpits and university churches framed the sweat's departure as evidence of divine favor toward a realm that had embraced the gospel more fully than its continental neighbors. "The Lord hath withdrawn his rod," declared one preacher at Paul's Cross in January 1552, "because we have turned from idols and images to the pure word." The sweat had been punishment for lingering popery, for the Mass, for pilgrimages, for trust in saints rather than in Christ alone. Its vanishing proved that Reformation worked, that cleansing the Church cleansed the land. This interpretation was convenient but fragile. When Edward VI died in July 1553 and Mary I restored Catholicism, the narrative flipped with remarkable speed. Catholic apologists now claim the sweat had been God's scourge against the heresies of the preceding reign. Its disappearance in 1551 had been a final warning before the true faith was restored. Mary's reign saw few public references to the sweat, perhaps because it no longer threatened, but when it was mentioned in Catholic sermons, it served as proof that Protestant innovations had invited divine wrath and that orthodoxy had appeased it. Under Elizabeth, after 1558, the Protestant reading returned and hardened into orthodoxy. Fox's Acts and Monuments, First English edition, 1563, briefly mentions the sweat as one of the plagues sent to chastise a people slow to embrace full reformation. Its end is quietly credited to the progress of godliness under Edward. By the 1570s and 1580s, the disease had become a cautionary tale in catechisms and household manuals. Sudden death could come at any hour, therefore live every day as though it were your last. The sweat's memory helped normalize the intense personal piety, daily scripture reading, private prayer, spiritual journaling that characterized Elizabethan and early Stuart Protestant culture. Yet beneath official sermons and printed moralizing lay a more diffuse, less articulate unease. Many English men and women of the 1560s and 1570s had been children or adolescents during the 1551 outbreak. A smaller but significant number had been young adults during 1528 or 1517. For them the sweat was not abstract history but lived memory. The smell of vinegar-soaked cloths, the sound of carts carrying bodies at dusk, the sight of a father or brother rising healthy at dawn and lying dead by vespers. That memory did not disappear with the disease. It left a residue of hyper-vigilance toward fevers, sweats, and sudden collapses that can be traced in letters, diaries, and medical consultations well into the next century. Consider the correspondence of the Cecil family. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, survived the 1551 outbreak as a young man. His son Robert Cecil was born in 1563, just 12 years after the last cases. Yet in the 1580s and 1590s, both father and son routinely mention the sweat when describing any sudden fever among servants or courtiers. In 1592, during an outbreak of what we now recognize as influenza, Burghley wrote to his son, "It cometh very like the old sweat, therefore take heed of cold after heat." The phrase, "the old sweat," became a shorthand for any rapidly progressing febrile illness that provoked existential dread. The term lingered in medical consultations into the 1620s and 1630s, long after anyone alive could have personal recollection of the real disease. This lingering anxiety influenced domestic life in subtle but measurable ways. Elizabethan and Jacobean household inventories show an increase in the number of spare sets of linens and blankets kept in well-to-do homes, more changes of bedding than strictly necessary for ordinary use. Medical receipt books compiled by gentlewomen contain numerous recipes to provoke sweat safely or to stay immoderate sweating, reflecting a belief that controlled perspiration might ward off the uncontrolled kind. The fashion for light summer clothing gave way in some circles to heavier layers even in warm weather, on the theory that keeping the pores closed prevented dangerous fluxes. The disappearance also accelerated a shift already underway in English attitudes toward the natural world. The sweat had been so capricious, so indifferent to rank, virtue, diet, or prayer, that it undermined older certainties about divine or humoral causation. After 1551, a growing number of physicians and educated laymen began to speak of diseases as having specific natures, rather than being mere imbalances of the four humors. John Caius's treatise, reprinted several times in the late 16th century, became a model for careful empirical description. By the 1590s, the new generation of Oxford and Cambridge medical graduates placed greater emphasis on observation and autopsy, habits partly born from decades of grappling with a killer that left no obvious signature lesions. The sweat's final exit also left a demographic imprint that shaped Elizabethan society in ways that are only now being quantified by historical demographers. The cumulative mortality across 6 major waves, 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, 1551, plus minor episodes, probably removed 80,120,000 people from a population averaging 2.83.2 million, roughly 3–4% over 66 years. That figure is modest compared with the Black Death or later plague visitations, but the age and sex selectivity amplified its effect. The repeated removal of prime-age males created periodic shortages of skilled labor, accelerated female participation in certain trades, and most importantly, shortened generational intervals. Daughters inherited and married younger, widows remarried faster, younger sons received larger portions of estates. The result was a slight but measurable compression of the age structure at marriage and inheritance that contributed to the rapid population growth of the later 16th century. Culturally, the sweat helped foster the Elizabethan fascination with mutability and sudden reversal. The disease had demonstrated that fortune could turn in hours, that the strong could be laid low while the weak survived, that plans, ambitions, dynasties could be erased between sunrise and sunset. That lesson resonated in an age obsessed with the wheel of fortune, with the fragility of courts and favorites, with the brevity of life. It echoes in Spenser's Faerie Queene, in Shakespeare's history plays, in the memento mori motifs that appear on so many Elizabethan tombs and memorial rings. As chimney sweepers come to dust is not just poetic flourish, it carries the memory of a disease that could reduce a vigorous man to a corpse before the sweat had dried. Politically, the sweat's departure in 1551 occurred at a moment of maximum vulnerability for the Protestant regime. Edward VI was 13, his health already fragile, his council riven by faction. The epidemic removed several key figures, bishops, councillors, kin, city aldermen, weakening the evangelical party at a critical juncture. When Edward died 2 years later, the Protestant cause was arguably less entrenched than it might have been had the sweat not thinned its leadership in 1551. Mary's restoration of Catholicism might have been shorter or less violent if the evangelical network had been stronger. In that sense, the sweat's final wave helped shape the confessional zigzag of the 1550s. Under Elizabeth, the memory of the sweat fed into a broader narrative of providential deliverance. England had been tested repeatedly, by foreign invasion threats, by internal rebellions, by religious upheaval, by epidemic, and each time God had preserved a faithful remnant. The sweat's disappearance became one more proof that England was an elect nation, chosen for special favor and special trial. That conviction, already strong in the 1570s, hardened during the Armada crisis of 1588 and colored the triumphalist tone of Elizabethan propaganda. Yet the relief was never complete. The sweat had vanished, but the possibility that something similar could return had not. When new fevers appeared, influenza in 1557-58, mysterious new agues in the 1570s, the deadly morbus gallicus variants, older people crossed themselves or murmured a prayer and said, "It is not the sweat, thanks be to God, but it cometh near." That phrase, "it cometh near," captures the lingering shadow. The sweat had taught the English that some diseases arrive without genealogy, without precedent, without mercy, and leave without explanation. That lesson stayed. By the early 17th century, the disease had become a grandparent's tale, something told to grandchildren on long winter evenings. In my father's time, there was a sickness called the sweat. The details blurred. Some said it killed in 3 hours, some in 3 days. Some said only men died, some said the rich suffered most, but the essence remained, a summer terror that could take anyone at any moment and then disappear forever. That blend of relief and unease became part of the Elizabethan temperament. It contributed to the era's peculiar mixture of confidence and fatalism, exuberance and melancholy, bold exploration and morbid introspection. The sweat had shown that life could end abruptly, therefore live boldly, love passionately, write memorably, build grandly, because tomorrow the sweat, or something like it, might come again. And so the story closes where it began, in the summer heat of 1551, with a kingdom holding its breath, waiting to see whether the sweating would return next year, or the year after, or never again. When never again proved to be the answer, England exhaled and stepped forward into an age that would remember the sweat not as a continuing nightmare, but as the last ghost of an older, more fragile world. The winter of 1551-1552 arrived cold and wet across southern England, the kind of season that normally brought agues, coughs, and the slow indoor dying of the old and frail. But this year the ordinary winter complaints felt almost welcome. They were familiar, they gave warning. They allowed time for confession, for making a will, for saying goodbye. The sweat had offered none of those courtesies, and now, week by week, it failed to reappear. In London, the change registered first in the smallest details of commerce. The weekly market at Smithfield, which had been half empty through August and September, began to fill again by December. Drovers brought cattle from the Midlands without fear that half their company would collapse by the roadside. Clothiers from the West Country risked longer journeys to the capital, knowing they would not return to ghost villages where their buyers had vanished overnight. The river wharves along the Thames saw barges unloading wool, grain, and wine with something approaching the old rhythm. Yet even as trade revived, people moved carefully. A merchant who once would have embraced an old acquaintance with both arms now offered only a stiff nod and kept 3 paces between them. A handshake, if it happened at all, was brief and followed by an immediate wiping of palms on a cloak. In the countryside, the relief expressed itself through work. Fields that had stood untended in late summer because plowmen, reapers, and shepherds had died or fled were slowly reclaimed. Tenants who had lost a son or a husband hired day laborers from neighboring parishes, paid higher wages than usual, and prayed the newcomers would not bring the sickness back with them. Manorial courts, which had been almost silent during the height of the epidemic, no one dared gather in such numbers, reconvened in January and February 1552. The records are terse but eloquent, entries for Harriet, the Lord's death duty paid on a tenant's demise appear in clusters from the previous summer, then drop sharply. Copyhold tenancies that had lapsed because no heir could be found were re-granted, often to the highest bidder rather than to kin. The land market quickened, not out of greed but out of necessity. Someone had to keep the fields under cultivation. Churches, too, felt the shift. The burial registers for December 1551 and the first months of 1552 show a return to normal seasonal mortality. Infants, the elderly, those already weakened by consumption or dropsy. The phrase of the sweat, or its Latin shorthand, disappears entirely after mid-November in most surviving books. Clergy who had conducted funerals almost daily through the summer now had time to preach proper sermons rather than hurried prayers at the graveside. In many parishes, the churchwarden's accounts record unusually large purchases of candles, incense, and altar cloths in the spring of 1552, perhaps Thanksgiving offerings, perhaps simply a catching up on maintenance deferred while the sexton was overwhelmed. Yet Thanksgiving was subdued. There were no officially proclaimed days of national deliverance, no special liturgies ordered by the young king's council. Edward VI's government had more pressing concerns. The currency was still debased, harvest yields had suffered from the labor shortages of the previous summer, and the Scottish border remained tense. The sweat's departure was noted in private letters and household accounts rather than in state proclamations. A gentleman in Kent writing to his brother in London in February 1552 remarked simply, "We have had no new cases since All Saints, thanks be to God, and men begin to hope it is gone for good." The phrase "for good" carried a hedge, hope, not certainty. That hedge of uncertainty is the key to understanding the psychological landscape of the early 1550s. People did not dare declare victory too loudly. They had seen the sweat retreat before. After 1485, after 1508, after 1517, after 1528, only to return more fiercely in later summers. The pattern had taught a kind of wary fatalism. A Somerset yeoman who kept a brief diary through the 1550s noted each year's, whether in May and June, with the same formula: hot and close, pray God send no sweat. Even in 1555, 4 years after the last cases, he still wrote the same prayer. The habit died harder than the disease. For those who had lost kin in 1551, the relief was shadowed by grief that had no public outlet. Mourning in Tudor England was supposed to be visible: black clothes, lowered voices, restrained behavior, but the sweat's speed had often prevented conventional rituals. Many bodies had been buried within hours, sometimes without a priest if the local incumbent was himself dying or fled. Widows and orphans had been left to manage estates, debts, and children without the slow comfort of a drawn-out sickbed farewell. In the months after the epidemic, therefore, one sees an unusual number of private memorials, small brass plaques in parish churches, additional bequests in later wills for the soul of my late husband taken by the sweat, or simple stones in churchyards inscribed only with a name and the year 1551. These were not grand chantry chapels, but quiet attempts to give meaning to deaths that had felt meaningless. The psychological imprint was especially deep among adolescents and young adults who had witnessed the disease at close quarters. Those born between 1520 and 1540 had grown up knowing the sweat as a recurring summer threat, the way later generations grew up knowing the possibility of polio or diphtheria. When it vanished, they did not experience pure liberation. They experienced the sudden removal of a lifelong background fear. That absence itself felt strange, almost unnatural. Diaries and letters from the 1560s and 1570s occasionally record dreams in which the sweat returns, sweat pouring from the dreamer's own body, or from a child's, or from the king himself. These are not frequent enough to constitute a literary genre, but they appear often enough to suggest that the mind continued to rehearse the old terror long after the body was safe. The disappearance also influenced the tone of Elizabethan culture in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The sweat had demonstrated that catastrophe could arrive without preamble and depart without explanation. That lesson fed into the period's characteristic blend of exuberance and melancholy, boldness and introspection. Elizabethan poetry, drama, and painting are saturated with images of mutability, flowers that bloom and wither in a day, bubbles on water, shadows that vanish at noon. The sweat is never named directly in most high literature. Shakespeare alludes to sudden fevers but never calls them the sweat, yet its ghost hovers in those images. When Prospero speaks of the baseless fabric of this vision dissolving like an insubstantial pageant, or when Hamlet meditates on how a man may fish with the worm that hath eat of a king, the sense of radical impermanence carries an echo of a disease that could erase a vigorous adult between breakfast and supper. The same sense of fragility helped shape the Elizabethan obsession with preparation for death, for judgment, for the unexpected. Household manuals, conduct books, and sermons all emphasize the need to live as though each day might be the last. Look to thy soul betimes, advises one popular devotional tract of the 1570s, for the sweat taught us that the strong man hath no lease on tomorrow. The sweat, by making sudden death seem ordinary rather than exceptional, helped normalize the intense, introspective Protestant piety that became so characteristic of the age. Daily self-examination, private prayer, keeping of spiritual journals, frequent reception of the Lord's Supper, all these practices gained urgency from the memory of a killer that gave no time for deathbed repentance. Politically, the sweat's final exit in 1551 occurred at a moment when the Protestant regime most needed stability. Edward VI's council had been shaken by factional struggles. The epidemic removed several influential figures and weakened others through grief or fear. When the king himself died in 1553, the Protestant cause was arguably less deeply rooted than it might have been had the sweat not thinned its leadership class in the preceding 2 years. Mary's Catholic restoration might have faced stiffer resistance or been shorter-lived if the evangelical network had been stronger. In that narrow sense, the sweat helped shape the confessional pendulum swing of the 1550s. Under Elizabeth, the memory of the sweat was quietly absorbed into a larger narrative of providential protection. England had been tested by schism, by rebellion, by foreign threats, by epidemic, and each time God had preserved a faithful people. The sweat's disappearance became retrospective proof that reformation had pleased heaven. When the Armada approached in 1588, preachers reminded congregations that the same God who had taken away the sweat from off the land would now scatter the Spanish fleet. The connection was rhetorical rather than logical, but it was emotionally powerful. Economically and socially, the post-1551 decades saw a rebound that was faster than many expected. Population growth resumed its upward trajectory almost immediately. Marriage ages dropped slightly, more young widows and widowers remarried quickly, birth rates ticked upward, and the labor shortages of the early 1550s eased by the early 1560s. The cloth trade, wool export, and internal markets recovered. By the 1570s, England was exporting more broadcloth than ever before. The sweat had been a severe but short-lived shock to an economy that was still fundamentally resilient, yet the unease never quite disappeared. When new epidemics arrived, influenza in 1557-58, plague in 1563, 1593, and 1603, older people instinctively compared them to the old sweat. Physicians were consulted not just for remedies but for reassurance. Is this the same sickness come again? The question appears in private letters as late as the 1620s. Each new fever was measured against the memory of 1551 and found wanting, less swift, less universal, less terrifying. That comparison itself was a form of comfort. The sweat had been the worst, and it was gone. By the time Shakespeare began writing, the sweat had become a grandfather's story. Playgoers who heard Mercutio speak of dreams that make men sweat with fear, or who watched characters die suddenly in the history plays, did not need footnotes to feel the resonance. The sweat had helped teach a generation that life is brief, fortune fickle, and death always possible. That lesson did not produce despair, it produced energy. If tomorrow might bring an end without warning, then today must be lived fully, loved passionately, built ambitiously, written memorably, explored boldly. The sweat's final gift to the Elizabethan world was therefore paradoxical. By disappearing completely, it allowed the English to remember it selectively, as a trial that had been endured, survived, and overcome. It became part of the national story of resilience, of a small island chosen for special testing and special deliverance. In that sense, the sweat helped make possible the confident, restless, creative, sometimes arrogant spirit we call Elizabethan. And so the long narration ends where it began, in the summer of 1551, with a kingdom waiting, sweating, fearing, hoping. When the waiting ended and the hoping proved justified, England stepped forward into an age that would never forget the lesson. Some things can vanish as suddenly as they arrive, leaving only memory, relief, and the quiet determination to live more vividly while there is still time. In London, the change registered first in the smallest details of commerce. The weekly market at Smithfield, which had been half empty through August and September, began to fill again by December. Drovers brought cattle from the Midlands without fear that half their company would collapse by the roadside. Clothiers from the West Country risked longer journeys to the capital, knowing they would not return to ghost villages where their buyers had vanished overnight. The river wharves along the Thames saw barges unloading wool, grain, and wine with something approaching the old rhythm. Yet even as trade revived, people moved carefully. A merchant who once would have embraced an old acquaintance with both arms now offered only a stiff nod and kept 3 paces between them. A handshake, if it happened at all, was brief and followed by an immediate wiping of palms on a cloak. The memory of how quickly a companion could turn from healthy to corpse lingered like damp in the walls. In the countryside, the relief expressed itself through work. Fields that had stood untended in late summer because plowmen, reapers, and shepherds had died or fled were slowly reclaimed. Tenants who had lost a son or a husband hired day laborers from neighboring parishes, paid higher wages than usual, and prayed the newcomers would not bring the sickness back with them. Manorial courts, which had been almost silent during the height of the epidemic, no one dared gather in such numbers, reconvened in January and February 1552. The records are terse but eloquent. Entries for Harriet, the Lord's death duty paid on a tenant's demise, appear in clusters from the previous summer, then drop sharply. Copyhold tenancies that had lapsed because no heir could be found were re-granted, often to the highest bidder rather than to kin. The land market quickened, not out of greed but out of necessity. Someone had to keep the fields under cultivation, rents had to be paid, the Lord's household fed. In Wiltshire and Somerset, where the 1551 wave had been particularly vicious, surveys from 1553 show a noticeable increase in enclosures and consolidation of holdings. Smaller fragmented plots passed into fewer, larger farms as surviving families bought or married into vacated land. Churches, too, felt the shift. The burial registers for December 1551 and the first months of 1552 show a return to normal seasonal mortality. Infants succumbing to fevers, the elderly to winter chills, those already weakened by consumption or dropsy. The phrase of the sweat, or its Latin shorthand, sudor anglicus, disappears entirely after mid-November in most surviving books from Shrewsbury to Norwich. Clergy who had conducted funerals almost daily through the summer now had time to preach proper sermons rather than hurried prayers at the graveside. In many parishes, the churchwarden's accounts record unusually large purchases of candles, incense, and altar cloths in the spring of 1552, perhaps Thanksgiving offerings, perhaps simply a catching up on maintenance deferred while the sexton was overwhelmed and the church plate tarnished from disuse. Special services of Thanksgiving were held in some places, though not universally ordered by the crown. Local parsons chose psalms like the 91st, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day," and preached on God's mercy in withdrawing the rod. Yet Thanksgiving was subdued. There were no officially proclaimed days of national deliverance, no special liturgies ordered by the young king's council. Edward VI's government had more pressing concerns. The currency remained debased from his father's reign, Harvest yields had suffered from the labor shortages of the previous summer, and the Scottish border remained tense with skirmishes. The sweat's departure was noted in private letters, household accounts, and merchants' ledgers rather than in state proclamations. A gentleman in Kent writing to his brother in London in February 1552 remarked simply, "We have had no new cases since All Saints, thanks be to God, and men begin to hope it is gone for good." The phrase "for good" carried a hedge, hope, not certainty. No one wanted to tempt Providence by proclaiming the end too loudly. That hedge of uncertainty is the key to understanding the psychological landscape of the early 1550s. People did not dare declare victory too loudly. They had seen the sweat retreat before, after the terror of 1485 that shadowed Henry VII's coronation, after the shorter but sharp assault of 1508, after the university decimating wave of 1517, after the continental leap of 1528 that carried it to Hamburg and Scandinavia. Each time it had slunk away with the autumn rains, only to return in a later summer more fiercely or in new places. The pattern had taught a kind of wary fatalism that did not vanish with the final cases. A Somerset yeoman who kept a brief diary through the 1550s noted each year's weather in May and June with the same formula: hot and close, pray God send no sweat. Even in 1555, 4 years after the last cases, he still wrote the same prayer when thunderheads gathered. The habit died harder than the disease itself. For those who had lost kin in 1551, the relief was shadowed by grief that had no public outlet. Mourning in Tudor England was supposed to be visible: black clothes for a year, lowered voices in company, restrained behavior at feasts, but the sweat's speed had often prevented conventional rituals. Many bodies had been buried within hours, sometimes without a priest if the local incumbent was himself dying or had fled to safer air. Widows and orphans had been left to manage estates, debts, wardships, and small children without the slow comfort of a drawn-out sickbed farewell, without time to summon distant kin or arrange a proper wake. In the months after the epidemic, therefore, one sees an unusual number of private memorials. Small brass plaques set into church floors in East Anglia and the Thames Valley, additional bequests in later wills for the soul of my late husband taken by the sweat in July 1551, or simple headstones in churchyards inscribed only with a name, age, and the year. These were not grand chantry chapels funded by wealthy guilds, but quiet, personal attempts to give meaning and permanence to deaths that had felt chaotic and almost casual in their suddenness. The psychological imprint was especially deep among adolescents and young adults who had witnessed the disease at close quarters. Those born between 1520 and 1540 had grown up knowing the sweat as a recurring summer threat, the way later generations would grow up knowing the possibility of polio or diphtheria before vaccines or smallpox before eradication. When it vanished, they did not experience pure liberation. They experienced the sudden removal of a lifelong background fear. That absence itself felt strange, almost unnatural, like waking from a decades-long nightmare and finding the room too quiet. Diaries and letters from the 1560s and 1570s occasionally record dreams in which the sweat returns, sweat pouring from the dreamer's own body in a stifling chamber, or from a child's forehead while the parent stands helpless, or from the king himself on his throne. These are not frequent enough to constitute a literary genre, but they appear often enough in personal papers to suggest that the mind continued to rehearse the old terror long after the body was safe from it. The disappearance also influenced the tone of what would become Elizabethan culture in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore once noticed. The sweat had demonstrated that catastrophe could arrive without preamble and depart without explanation or apology. That lesson fed into the period's characteristic blend of exuberance and melancholy, boldness and introspection, world-conquering ambition, and private memento mori. Elizabethan poetry, drama, and painting are saturated with images of mutability, flowers that bloom at dawn and wither by dusk, bubbles rising and bursting on a stream, shadows that lengthen and vanish when the sun moves, soap bubble lives, glass lives, pageant lives that dissolve into thin air. The sweat is never named directly in most high literature. Shakespeare alludes to sudden fevers and sweat of death in several plays, but never calls the phenomenon by its Tudor name, yet its ghost hovers in those images of radical impermanence. When Prospero in The Tempest speaks of the baseless fabric of this vision dissolving like an insubstantial pageant faded, or when Hamlet meditates on how a man may fish with the worm that hath eat of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm, the sense of fragile, reversible existence carries an echo of a disease that could erase a vigorous adult between breakfast and supper, leaving only a sweat-soaked sheet and a hastily dug grave. The same sense of fragility helped shape the Elizabethan obsession with preparation for death, for divine judgment, for the unexpected reversal of fortune. Household manuals, conduct books, sermons, and even letter-writing guides all emphasize the need to live as though each day might be the last. Look to thy soul betimes, advises one popular devotional tract of the 1570s, for the sweat taught us that the strong man hath no lease on tomorrow, nor the rich man on his gold. The sweat, by making sudden death seem ordinary rather than exceptional for an entire generation, helped normalize the intense, introspective Protestant piety that became so characteristic of the age. Daily self-examination, private prayer in closet or chamber, keeping of spiritual journals, frequent meditation on mortality, regular reception of the Lord's Supper in a worthy state, all these practices gained urgency from the memory of a killer that gave no time for deathbed repentance, no interval for summoning a priest or dictating long codicils. The sweat had shown what it meant to die unshriven. Elizabethan devotional culture sought to ensure that never happened again. Politically, the sweat's final exit in 1551 occurred at a moment when the Protestant regime under Edward VIII most needed stability and continuity. The young king was 13, his health already fragile from chronic illness, his council riven by factional struggles between Northumberland and the old Seymour interest. The epidemic removed several key figures, bishops like John Taylor of Lincoln, councillors kin, city aldermen who had backed evangelical policies, and weakened others through grief or fear. When Edward himself died in July 1553 after a prolonged decline, the Protestant cause was arguably less deeply rooted in local communities and less well-manned at the center than it might have been had the sweat not thinned its leadership class in the preceding 2 years. Mary I's rapid restoration of Catholicism might have faced stiffer resistance or been shorter-lived if the evangelical network had been stronger and more confident. In that narrow, contingent sense, the sweat helped shape the confessional pendulum swing of the 1550s, contributing to the brevity of Edward's reforms and the violence of Mary's counter-reformation. Under Elizabeth I, after the accession in November 1558, the memory of the sweat was quietly absorbed into a larger narrative of providential protection and national election. England had been tested repeatedly, by schism under Henry VIII, by faction and boy kingship under Edward, by Catholic restoration and burnings under Mary, by foreign invasion threats, by internal rebellions like the Northern Rising of 1569, and each time God had preserved a faithful remnant. The sweat's disappearance in 1551 became retrospective proof that Reformation had pleased heaven, that turning from popish superstition to the pure word had lifted the scourge. When the Armada approached in 1588, preachers reminded congregations that the same God who had taken away the sweat from off the land in the days of King Edward would now scatter the Spanish fleet and preserve his elect island. The connection was rhetorical rather than strictly logical, but it was emotionally powerful and politically useful. It fed the myth of England as an elect nation, chosen for special trial and special deliverance, a myth that sustained morale through the long war with Spain and the anxieties of succession. Economically and socially, the post-1551 decades saw a rebound that was faster and more vigorous than many contemporaries had feared. Population growth, which had stalled or dipped slightly in the hard years of the 1540s and early 1550s, partly from sweat mortality, partly from poor harvests and inflation, resumed its upward trajectory almost immediately. Marriage ages dropped slightly as young widows and widowers remarried quickly to rebuild households. Birth rates ticked upward in the later 1550s and 1560s. The labor shortages of the immediate aftermath eased by the early 1560s as surviving children reached working age. The cloth trade, wool export, and internal markets recovered with surprising speed. By the 1570s, England was exporting more broadcloth than ever before, and London's population began its steep Elizabethan climb toward 200,000 by 1600. The sweat had been a severe but short-lived shock to an economy that was still fundamentally resilient and that benefited from the absence of further major visitations. Yet the unease never quite disappeared. When new epidemics arrived, influenza-like fevers in 1557-58 that killed Edward VI's successor in waiting, plague in 1563, 1593, and the devastating outbreak of 1603 that shadowed James I's accession, older people instinctively compared them to the old sweat. Physicians were consulted not just for remedies but for reassurance. Is this the same sickness come again in another form? The question appears in private letters, privy council minutes, and diplomatic dispatches as late as the 1620s. Each new fever was measured against the memory of 1551 and found wanting, less swift in onset, less universal in its terror, less indifferent to prayer or rank. That comparison itself was a form of comfort. The sweat had been the worst England had endured in living memory, and it was gone forever. By the time Shakespeare began writing in the late 1580s and 1590s, the sweat had become a grandfather's story, something recounted on long winter evenings or in the alehouse when conversation turned to old times. Playgoers who heard Mercutio and Romeo and Juliet speak of dreams so vivid they make men sweat with fear, or who watched characters die suddenly and inexplicably in the history plays, did not need footnotes to feel the resonance. The sweat had helped teach a generation, and the one that followed, that life is brief, fortune fickle, death always possible without ceremony. That lesson did not produce despair, it produced energy. If tomorrow might bring an end without warning, then today must be lived fully, loved passionately, built ambitiously, written memorably, explored boldly across seas, performed on stages, debated in parliaments, painted on canvases, sung in madrigals. The sweat's final gift to the Elizabethan world was therefore paradoxical. By disappearing completely after 1551, it allowed the English to remember it selectively, as a trial that had been endured, survived, and overcome by divine favor and human resilience. It became part of the national story of exceptionalism, of a small island tested by fire and sweat and found worthy. In that sense, the sweat helped make possible the confident, restless, creative, sometimes arrogant spirit we call Elizabethan, a spirit that looked backward at the vanished plague with gratitude and forward into an uncertain but expansive future with something close to hope. And so the long narration of the English sweating sickness ends where it began, in the summer heat of 1551, with a kingdom waiting, sweating, fearing, hoping. When the waiting ended and the hoping proved justified, England exhaled and stepped forward into an age that would never forget the lesson. Some things can vanish as suddenly as they arrive, leaving only memory, relief, and the quiet determination to live more vividly while there is still time. In London, the change registered first in the smallest details of commerce. The weekly market at Smithfield, which had been half empty through August and September, began to fill again by December. Drovers brought cattle from the Midlands without fear that half their company would collapse by the roadside. Clothiers from the West Country risked longer journeys to the capital, knowing they would not return to ghost villages where their buyers had vanished overnight. The river wharves along the Thames saw barges unloading wool, grain, and wine with something approaching the old rhythm. Yet even as trade revived, people moved carefully. A merchant who once would have embraced an old acquaintance with both arms now offered only a stiff nod and kept 3 paces between them. A handshake, if it happened at all, was brief and followed by an immediate wiping of palms on a cloak. The memory of how quickly a companion could turn from healthy to corpse lingered like damp in the walls. In the countryside, the relief expressed itself through work. Fields that had stood untended in late summer because plowmen, reapers, and shepherds had died or fled were slowly reclaimed. Tenants who had lost a son or a husband hired day laborers from neighboring parishes, paid higher wages than usual, and prayed the newcomers would not bring the sickness back with them. Manorial courts, which had been almost silent during the height of the epidemic, no one dared gather in such numbers, reconvened in January and February 1552. The records are terse but eloquent. Entries for Harriet, the Lord's death duty paid on a tenant's demise, appear in clusters from the previous summer, then drop sharply. Copyhold tenancies that had lapsed because no heir could be found were re-granted, often to the highest bidder rather than to kin. The land market quickened, not out of greed but out of necessity. Someone had to keep the fields under cultivation, rents had to be paid, the Lord's household fed. In Wiltshire and Somerset, where the 1551 wave had been particularly vicious, surveys from 1553 show a noticeable increase in enclosures and consolidation of holdings. Smaller fragmented plots passed into fewer, larger farms as surviving families bought or married into vacated land. Churches, too, felt the shift. The burial registers for December 1551 and the first months of 1552 show a return to normal seasonal mortality. Infants succumbing to fevers, the elderly to winter chills, those already weakened by consumption or dropsy. The phrase of the sweat, or its Latin shorthand, sudor anglicus, disappears entirely after mid-November in most surviving books from Shrewsbury to Norwich. Clergy who had conducted funerals almost daily through the summer now had time to preach proper sermons rather than hurried prayers at the graveside. In many parishes, the churchwarden's accounts record unusually large purchases of candles, incense, and altar cloths in the spring of 1552, perhaps Thanksgiving offerings, perhaps simply a catching up on maintenance deferred while the sexton was overwhelmed and the church plate tarnished from disuse. Special services of Thanksgiving were held in some places, though not universally ordered by the crown. Local parsons chose psalms like the 91st, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day," and preached on God's mercy in withdrawing the rod. Yet Thanksgiving was subdued. There were no officially proclaimed days of national deliverance, no special liturgies ordered by the young king's council. Edward VI's government had more pressing concerns. The currency remained debased from his father's reign, harvest yields had suffered from the labor shortages of the previous summer, and the Scottish border remained tense with skirmishes. The sweat's departure was noted in private letters, household accounts, and merchants' ledgers rather than in state proclamations. A gentleman in Kent writing to his brother in London in February 1552 remarked simply, "We have had no new cases since All Saints, thanks be to God, and men begin to hope it is gone for good." The phrase "for good" carried a hedge, hope, not certainty. No one wanted to tempt Providence by proclaiming the end too loudly. That hedge of uncertainty is the key to understanding the psychological landscape of the early 1550s. People did not dare declare victory too loudly. They had seen the sweat retreat before, after the terror of 1485 that shadowed Henry VII's coronation, after the shorter but sharp assault of 1508, after the university decimating wave of 1517, after the continental leap of 1528 that carried it to Hamburg and Scandinavia. Each time it had slunk away with the autumn rains, only to return in a later summer more fiercely or in new places. The pattern had taught a kind of wary fatalism that did not vanish with the final cases. A Somerset yeoman who kept a brief diary through the 1550s noted each year's weather in May and June with the same formula: hot and close, pray God send no sweat. Even in 1555, 4 years after the last cases, he still wrote the same prayer when thunderheads gathered. the habit died harder than the disease itself. For those who had lost kin in 1551, the relief was shadowed by grief that had no public outlet. Mourning in Tudor England was supposed to be visible: black clothes for a year, lowered voices in company, restrained behavior at feasts, but the sweat speed had often prevented conventional rituals. Many bodies had been buried within hours, sometimes without a priest if the local incumbent was himself dying or had fled to safer air. Widows and orphans had been left to manage estates, debts, wardships, and small children without the slow comfort of a drawn-out sickbed farewell, without time to summon distant kin or arrange a proper wake. In the months after the epidemic, therefore, one sees an unusual number of private memorials. Small brass plaques set into church floors in East Anglia and the Thames Valley, additional bequests in later wills for the soul of my late husband taken by the sweat in July 1551, or simple headstones in churchyards inscribed only with a name, age, and the year. These were not grand chantry chapels funded by wealthy guilds, but quiet, personal attempts to give meaning and permanence to deaths that had felt chaotic and almost casual in their suddenness. The psychological imprint was especially deep among adolescents and young adults who had witnessed the disease at close quarters. Those born between 1520 and 1540 had grown up knowing the sweat as a recurring summer threat, the way later generations would grow up knowing the possibility of polio or diphtheria before vaccines or smallpox before eradication. When it vanished, they did not experience pure liberation. They experienced the sudden removal of a lifelong background fear. That absence itself felt strange, almost unnatural, like waking from a decades-long nightmare and finding the room too quiet. Diaries and letters from the 1560s and 1570s occasionally record dreams in which the sweat returns, sweat pouring from the dreamer's own body in a stifling chamber, or from a child's forehead while the parent stands helpless, or from the king himself on his throne. These are not frequent enough to constitute a literary genre, but they appear often enough in personal papers to suggest that the mind continued to rehearse the old terror long after the body was safe from it. The disappearance also influenced the tone of what would become Elizabethan culture in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore once noticed. The sweat had demonstrated that catastrophe could arrive without preamble and depart without explanation or apology. That lesson fed into the period's characteristic blend of exuberance and melancholy, boldness and introspection, world-conquering ambition, and private memento mori. Elizabethan poetry, drama, and painting are saturated with images of mutability: flowers that bloom at dawn and wither by dusk, bubbles rising and bursting on a stream, shadows that lengthen and vanish when the sun moves, soap bubble lives, glass lives, pageant lives that dissolve into thin air. The sweat is never named directly in most high literature. Shakespeare alludes to sudden fevers and sweat of death in several plays, but never calls the phenomenon by its Tudor name, yet its ghost hovers in those images of radical impermanence. When Prospero in The Tempest speaks of the baseless fabric of this vision dissolving like an insubstantial pageant faded, or when Hamlet meditates on how a man may fish with the worm that hath eat of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm, the sense of fragile, reversible existence carries an echo of a disease that could erase a vigorous adult between breakfast and supper, leaving only a sweat-soaked sheet and a hastily dug grave. The same sense of fragility helped shape the Elizabethan obsession with preparation for death, for divine judgment, for the unexpected reversal of fortune. Household manuals, conduct books, sermons, and even letter-writing guides all emphasize the need to live as though each day might be the last. Look to thy soul betimes, advises one popular devotional tract of the 1570s, for the sweat taught us that the strong man hath no lease on tomorrow, nor the rich man on his gold. The sweat, by making sudden death seem ordinary rather than exceptional for an entire generation, helped normalize the intense, introspective Protestant piety that became so characteristic of the age. Daily self-examination, private prayer in closet or chamber, keeping of spiritual journals, frequent meditation on mortality, regular reception of the Lord's Supper in a worthy state. All these practices gained urgency from the memory of a killer that gave no time for deathbed repentance, no interval for summoning a priest or dictating long codicils. The sweat had shown what it meant to die unshriven. Elizabethan devotional culture sought to ensure that never happened again. Politically, the sweat's final exit in 1551 occurred at a moment when the Protestant regime under Edward VI most needed stability and continuity. The young king was 13, his health already fragile from chronic illness, his council riven by factional struggles between Northumberland and the old Seymour interest. The epidemic removed several key figures, bishops like John Taylor of Lincoln, councillors kin, city aldermen who had backed evangelical policies, and weakened others through grief or fear. When Edward himself died in July 1553 after a prolonged decline, the Protestant cause was arguably less deeply rooted in local communities and less well-manned at the center than it might have been had the sweat not thinned its leadership class in the preceding 2 years. Mary I's rapid restoration of Catholicism might have faced stiffer resistance or been shorter-lived if the evangelical network had been stronger and more confident. In that narrow, contingent sense, the sweat helped shape the confessional pendulum swing of the 1550s, contributing to the brevity of Edward's reforms and the violence of Mary's counter-reformation. Under Elizabeth I, after the accession in November 1558, the memory of the sweat was quietly absorbed into a larger narrative of providential protection and national election. England had been tested repeatedly, by schism under Henry VIII, by faction and boy kingship under Edward, by Catholic restoration and burnings under Mary, by foreign invasion threats, by internal rebellions like the Northern Rising of 1569, and each time God had preserved a faithful remnant. The sweat's disappearance in 1551 became retrospective proof that Reformation had pleased heaven, that turning from popish superstition to the pure word had lifted the scourge. When the Armada approached in 1588, preachers reminded congregations that the same God who had taken away the sweat from off the land in the days of King Edward would now scatter the Spanish fleet and preserve his elect island. The connection was rhetorical rather than strictly logical, but it was emotionally powerful and politically useful. It fed the myth of England as an elect nation, chosen for special trial and special deliverance, a myth that sustained morale through the long war with Spain and the anxieties of succession. Economically and socially, the post-1551 decades saw a rebound that was faster and more vigorous than many contemporaries had feared. Population growth, which had stalled or dipped slightly in the hard years of the 1540s and early 1550s, partly from sweat mortality, partly from poor harvests and inflation, resumed its upward trajectory almost immediately. Marriage ages dropped slightly as young widows and widowers remarried quickly to rebuild households. Birth rates ticked upward in the later 1550s and 1560s. The labor shortages of the immediate aftermath eased by the early 1560s as surviving children reached working age. The cloth trade, wool export, and internal markets recovered with surprising speed. By the 1570s, England was exporting more broadcloth than ever before, and London's population began its steep Elizabethan climb toward 200,000 by 1600. The sweat had been a severe but short-lived shock to an economy that was still fundamentally resilient and that benefited from the absence of further major visitations, yet the unease never quite disappeared. When new epidemics arrived, influenza-like fevers in 1557-58 that killed Edward VI's successor in waiting, plague in 1563, 1593, and the devastating outbreak of 1603 that shadowed James I's accession, older people instinctively compared them to the old sweat. Physicians were consulted not just for remedies but for reassurance. Is this the same sickness come again in another form? The question appears in private letters, privy council minutes, and diplomatic dispatches as late as the 1620s. Each new fever was measured against the memory of 1551 and found wanting, less swift in onset, less universal in its terror, less indifferent to prayer or rank. That comparison itself was a form of comfort. The sweat had been the worst England had endured in living memory, and it was gone forever. By the time Shakespeare began writing in the late 1580s and 1590s, the sweat had become a grandfather's story, something recounted on long winter evenings or in the alehouse when conversation turned to old times. Playgoers who heard Mercutio and Romeo and Juliet speak of dreams so vivid they make men sweat with fear, or who watched characters die suddenly and inexplicably in the history plays, did not need footnotes to feel the resonance. The sweat had helped teach a generation, and the one that followed, that life is brief, fortune fickle, death always possible without ceremony. That lesson did not produce despair, it produced energy. If tomorrow might bring an end without warning, then today must be lived fully, loved passionately, built ambitiously, written memorably, explored boldly across seas, performed on stages, debated in parliaments, painted on canvases, sung in madrigals. The sweat's final gift to the Elizabethan world was therefore paradoxical. By disappearing completely after 1551, it allowed the English to remember it selectively, as a trial that had been endured, survived, and overcome by divine favor and human resilience. It became part of the national story of exceptionalism, of a small island tested by fire and sweat and found worthy. In that sense, the sweat helped make possible the confident, restless, creative, sometimes arrogant spirit we call Elizabethan, a spirit that looked backward at the vanished plague with gratitude and forward into an uncertain but expansive future with something close to hope. And so the long narration of the English sweating sickness, the mysterious, terrifying, vanishing killer that haunted Tudor England for 66 years, finally reaches its close. It began in the triumphant but shadowed summer of 1485 and ended in the quiet, watchful winter of 1551-1552, leaving behind a nation forever changed in subtle ways, more introspective in faith, more conscious of fragility, more determined to seize the day, more convinced that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Thank you for joining me on this deep journey through one of history's strangest and most haunting epidemics. Please let us know in the comments, where are you watching this history video from today, and what time is it there right now? Drop your city or country in the current time. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the world. And if you found this narration valuable, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into the mysteries of the past. See you in the next video. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, history is full of questions that still have no answers. Until next time.